So welcome to the June 2021 UCLA Anderson Forecast Economic and Real Estate Outlook Conference. Today's event is being held jointly with the ZIMAN Center for Real Estate at Anderson and the Association for Real Estate, which is our student MBA organization. I'm Jerry Nicholsberg, Faculty Director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast. The first part of our program will feature a roll-out of our latest forecast. And first up on the program is Leo Feller with the U.S. Outlook. Leo leads our U.S. forecast team. Leo came to us from Cornerstone and Boston Consulting Group and Johns Hopkins University, received his PhD from Brown University. And I will follow Leo then with the California Outlook. And then after that, we will have a presentation on some new research by Lila Bengali and William Yu. Lila came to us from Yale University, where she earned her PhD, and William through a teaching stint in Minnesota from the University of Washington, where he earned his PhD. And they've been doing some exciting research in collaboration and with the support of GoDaddy. And the research is focusing on infrastructure, and in particular, broadband infrastructure, which is a topic of policy discussions in Sacramento and Washington today. They're looking at it in a different way as to the economic impact of this, particularly with respect to unemployment. So that's going to be really interesting. That'll be our third presentation of the morning. And then we will have a short Q&A session for those who are in the enhanced webinar. You can ask questions over Slido. And our brilliant MBA students are going to be asking your questions to the forecast team. Also on the forecast team with us today is David Schulman. David, as you know, has been with the forecast for now more than 15 years and went emeritus last year, but he is back for this conference, and we very much welcome David back, and David will be able to weigh in on questions as well. You should have the Slido instructions in the email that you received. If you have never used Slido before, it's really easy to download on your phone, easy to use, and you just put in that number and everything comes up. After that, we'll take a short break and stretch our legs and return for our keynote speaker on the future of the office. And following the keynote, we're going to have two panels. The first one will be a brief overview of the latest results of the Alan Matkins UCLA Anderson Forecast commercial real estate survey that looks at 8 markets in California. And so we have some results that are really quite interesting given the depth of the recession and the pandemic. And then the second, which will be moderated by Stuart Gabriel, who is Professor of Finance and Real Estate and the Faculty Director of the ZIMAN Center. We'll take a deep dive into commercial real estate and the commercial real estate outlook for California. So before we begin and jump into the forecast, I want to thank our sponsors. You know, we're a public institution. This is a time of recession and financial stress, and we could not bring to you these programs, and we could not do our research without the generous support of our sponsors. We really appreciate you. Our principal sponsor today is RSM. Our platinum sponsors are the law firm of Alan Matkins, Cathay Bank, Clark Construction, Leap Development, and University Credit Union. Thank you to our platinum sponsors. Our gold level sponsors today are Bank of California, California Bank and Trust, California Steel Industries, Robert Half, and Wells Fargo, the private bank. Thank you to our gold level sponsors. Our silver level sponsors are Pacific Western Bank and Union Bank, the private bank. And thank you to our silver level sponsors. At the bronze level, Colliers, Hanmi Bank, HDR, Marsh & McClellan Insurance Agency, MBK Real Estate Companies, and PCL Construction. thank you to our bronze level sponsors. At the Bruin level, First Choice Bank, Gerber Kawasaki Wealth and Investment Management, Ely Commercial Real Estate, Marcus and Millichamp, and Parkview Financial. Thank you, Bruin level sponsors. Our media sponsor today is the Los Angeles Business Journal, and our academic sponsor is UCLA Extension, and thank you to both of them. Again, we could not put these programs on without the generous contributions and support of our sponsors, and we are most appreciative of them. Now, the folks behind the scenes who make all of this possible, George Lee, Seth Katz, and Mina Prieto, have spent tireless hours on the program, and I just want to express my personal thanks and appreciation to George, Seth, and Mina for all that they've done to bring this program to us today. So with that, I think we should find out what's going on in the US economy. Leo.
Jerry, thanks for the introduction. So good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My forecast is for a robust but bumpy recovery as the economy transitions from the pandemic. So we'll talk about 6 topics today: GDP, inflation, employment, productivity, housing markets, and interest rates. So jumping right into GDP, we're forecasting a 7.1% growth rate for 2021. This is coming off of a 3.5 percentage point decline in 2020. 2020 was the worst decline that we've had since the 1960s. This growth that we're going to have in 2021 of 7.1% is going to be one of the best years of growth that we've had since the 1960s. Following that, we expect growth to still be very robust into 2022 at 5%, and then slowly trending down to about 2.2% in 2023. If you look at it in quarterly figures, the peak that we're expecting is right now during the second quarter of 2021, an 11.1% growth rate at an annualized rate. And then slowly we'll get back down to around 2.1, 2.2, 2.3%, which is roughly equivalent to the rates of growth that we had before the pandemic. In terms of the levels of GDP, we expect that we will surpass the pre-pandemic peak right now as we get into towards the end of the second quarter of 2021. And then with the robust growth that we're expecting this quarter and into next quarter, we expect that we will hit the pre-pandemic trend by the end of the third quarter of 2021. And thereafter, we will surpass where we would have been in the prior trend of the pandemic, and we will slowly flatten out to have similar growth rates in the outer years, but just at a higher level of economic output. And we'll discuss why we'll be able to have a higher level of economic output. Our forecast comes from 2 pieces. One is some satiation in the consumption of goods. So during the pandemic, we consumed a lot more stuff than we normally do. This was more electronics. This was more home office equipment. This was more do-it-yourself rehabs for our homes. All that goods consumption led to a spike in imports. And it also led to a lot of supply constraints that we're still experiencing right now. But our expectation is that as people are able to go out and consume more services, and as services consumption picks up, people are going to be spending more on restaurants, on entertainment, on recreation, and less on buying stuff. And so our expectation is that goods consumption will go back to trend. Services consumption will overshoot trend slightly as people release pent-up demand and as people release a lot of the savings that they accumulated over the course of the pandemic. The one part of goods that we expect to remain fairly strong is first appliances, furniture, and that's related to the strong housing market. And the second is vehicles. So we have a lot of disposable income right now in the economy, and we expect a lot of this to be used towards consumption of automobiles. Turning now to inflation. Many of you probably saw the surprising April inflation numbers. The CPI came in at 0.8% month over month. If you were to annualize this and assume that 0.8 month over month were to last for all 12 months in a year, you would get a 9.6% annual rate. And if you compare it to April of last year, you would get a 4.2% year over year increase in the consumer price index. Now, when you break this down, you see that a lot of the factors that were driving this April increase in inflation are factors that are likely to be transitory. So some of the pieces are airline fares, where you see this strong recovery, right? This is people getting back on the road, starting leisure travel once again. You see that in lodging away from home. This is people staying at hotels. You see this in car and truck rentals. The story for car and truck rentals is particularly interesting because a lot of the car rental companies this time last year had to sell off some of their fleet to raise capital. They did not go out and buy new cars. And so this led to constrained supply of rental cars in the market. And now, we want to do domestic travel. We want to drive around the country. And so demand for car and truck rentals has spiked. The last piece here that's interesting is used cars and trucks, related to two factors. One is that people shied away from using public transit, relied more on private transport, and so went out and bought used cars and trucks. And the second piece being that we have a semiconductor shortage, which means that we're producing less new cars. And so some of the demand is shifting towards used cars. We don't expect these types of inflation to be sustained, right? We expect this to normalize as the pandemic goes on, as we transition away from the pandemic, and as some of the supply constraints ease. So we can see already a few areas where we're getting easing pressure on supply constraints. The first has to do with semiconductors. And so you can see that we had a big surge in imports between February, March, now into April, into US imports of semiconductors, and in Taiwanese exports to the US. Taiwan is the country that produces, or is the area that produces, most of our semiconductors. And so you can see that those are coming into beginning to come into the US and relieving some supply constraints. The second piece is on commodity prices. So commodity prices appear to have peaked in early May. They have since come down from their highs. And since I made this chart, lumber prices have come down even further. And so what we're seeing again is that commodity prices, some of these supply pressures are beginning to ease, and that should translate into lower pressures on consumer inflation. So our forecast for inflation is that we will get to slightly above around 2.5, 2.6, 2.7% in terms of inflation in personal consumption expenditures. If you exclude food and energy, you get a little bit of a delay in when we will hit something at around 2.6, 2.7%. And then by 2023, we start trending down again to around 2.2% in the outer years. If you look at this in quarterly numbers, the story is much the same. We will see the peak in inflation in a little bit later this year, fourth quarter of 2021, first quarter of 2022, and then our inflation numbers will stabilize again towards slightly above historic trends of around 2.2% by 2023. The markets also expect this level of inflation in outer years. So what you're seeing here is a chart of the five-year forward. Basically, that's the market's expectations for inflation between 2026 to 2031. So 5 years from now, the average 5 years hence. And that measure comes in right at around 2.2%. And so you can see that that measure is also similar to what we had immediately prior to the pandemic. So inflation expectations are adjusting at around this 2.2% mark, which is similar to what we had before the pandemic occurred. Now, one thing I'd like to note is that futures markets consistently overestimate the potential for inflation by pricing in earlier increases in the Fed funds rate. So what this chart shows is the actual effective Fed funds rate in orange, and these blue lines are market expectations of where market participants expect the Fed funds rate to go. And you can see that even during, coming right out of the great financial crisis, you had increases in the expectations that market participants expected the Federal Reserve to increase rates at several different points in time. And what happened is that the Fed Reserve kept rates low until right around 2015, and then it started increasing. Again, we have the same pattern beginning to take shape here, where the Fed Reserve has indicated that it's going to keep rates low, but market participants are already expecting a bit of an increase. We'll see this time around if the story that prevails is one where market participants overestimate and price in inflation earlier than it occurs, or if the Fed Reserve actually has to start increasing the Fed funds rate to try to control inflation. Let me turn now to employment. So a big question that came out of the jobs report for April was, where are all the workers? So despite having an unemployment rate of 6.1%, despite having a jobs deficit of 8.2 million jobs that were down from the beginning of the pandemic, despite having a record 8.1 million job openings, the economy only added 266,000 jobs in April. Expectations were for a number of around 1 million jobs. Our next jobs report is going to come out this Friday, June 4th. We are looking at a number of about 1 million. We'll see again if there's a negative surprise and we get a number that's small like what happened in April. So there's a few hypotheses for why we got disappointing jobs numbers in April. The first is that schools aren't fully reopened. Right now, only 6 out of 10 students, so 6 out of 10 students are doing either full-time remote school, or they're only in school some days of the week. So they're partial online, right? So that means only 40% of students are back in school full-time, right? That means that there's childcare constraints for families as they try to homeschool their children. The second possibility is that there's been a disincentive because of unemployment insurance. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. The third is that the wages for frontline jobs might just not be worth the COVID risk. So at the time of the April jobs report, only 30% of the US population had been fully vaccinated. This is in mid-April. And so the question is, are the wages for frontline restaurant jobs sufficient at a time when 30% of the population has been vaccinated to justify the risk of exposure? And so now, as we get into June, looking back at the May jobs report, which will be mid-May, will be the reference week. At this point in time, we've had slightly over 40% of the population fully vaccinated. And then the last explanation is a spatial and sectoral mismatch between people and jobs. So the story here is that we've had a lot of movement of people towards the suburbs. And so you have more demand for restaurant services in suburban areas. We have a sectoral mismatch between people and jobs. So we created a lot of jobs in industries and sectors like transportation and warehousing. And so we pulled people away from leisure and hospitality towards transportation and warehousing. But we also moved people towards more suburban areas. And the question is, how do you get workers that might have been catering to a downtown population to now locate and work and cater to a suburban population? So let me do 2 deep dives on these topics. The first relates to childcare constraints. Overall, a paper by Jason Furman and co-authors found that there aren't childcare constraints overall in the economy. But when you break this down, you see that for particular groups of people, particularly women who have less than a bachelor's degree, those with less than one child, those with at least one child under the age of 13, have still been back at work less than those that don't have any children. There's no difference for women with at least a bachelor's degree or above. For men with children are actually have a higher employment to population ratio relative to before the pandemic compared to men without children. So for men, the child constraints have been binding. But for this group, women with less than a bachelor's degree, the childcare constraint is binding. And when you hear about a labor shortage, oftentimes you're hearing about this in the leisure and hospitality sector. And it's in the leisure and hospitality sector where women with less than a bachelor's degree are disproportionately represented. And so for a specific sector, leisure and hospitality, childcare constraints are likely to be binding. The next deep dive is on unemployment insurance. So 23 states have moved up the expiration from September 6th to sometime in June or July. And one question that we're about to discover the answer to is whether or not ending unemployment insurance early and compelling people to take jobs that they might otherwise not take, whether this is better overall for the economy, or if withdrawing the extra $300 per week actually pulls money out of these local economies and makes the economy worse off, right? So we're going to be able to have a natural experiment right now across 23 states that are doing this to see whether or not ending unemployment insurance is going to help or hurt their economies relative to those states that maintain the unemployment benefits through September. Our forecast for the unemployment rate is that it will slowly come down to 5.7% this quarter, to 4.5% by the end of 2021, to 4.0% by the end of 2022, and finally to 3.7% by the end of 2023. This gets us back to about the levels that we had prior to the pandemic in terms of unemployment rates by the end of 2023. What that means for the numbers of jobs that we have to add on average each month. So again, this is going to be the May jobs report that comes out this Friday, is that we're expecting on average 740,000 jobs to be added per month right now in the second quarter, up to 1 million jobs added per month in the third quarter. Because we had 266,000 jobs in April, in order to get to this 740,000 on average, we need 1 million jobs added in May, and we need another 1 million jobs added in June. And so our expectation is that we're going to have 1 million jobs added in May, 1 million in June, and on average 1 million in July, 1 million in August, 1 million in September. So a very robust period of job creation as not only the economy fully reopens, but also schools reopen and the childcare constraints ease, and COVID cases come down, so people are not as concerned about taking on frontline jobs. In terms of employment numbers, we expect to be back to the pre-pandemic levels of employment by mid-2022. And then beyond that, we'll surpass the levels of employment that we had prior to the pandemic. So it'll take some time for us to reach back to pre-pandemic levels of employment. Turning now to productivity, if you put these numbers together, the employment growth and the GDP growth, what you get is a surge in output per worker that is sustained over time. And so there are a few reasons we expect to be above trend in productivity in terms of output per worker. One is that the pandemic forced the adoption of a lot of technologies, accelerated the adoption of a lot of new technologies. We see this right now through Zoom. We see this through mobile ordering. We see this through using apps and kiosks to be able to fulfill orders. People have shifted more of their consumption to online shopping. This is a much more productive way of processing and producing output. And so our expectation is that this will be sustained. A lot of the technology that we've adopted over the course of the pandemic, we will maintain going forward. And that means more output per worker going forward through 2023. And then the rate at which productivity increases normalizes to the rate similar that we had prior to the pandemic. All right, last few points is that as we know, residential real estate is booming. We are expecting 1.64 million housing units in 2021 and an 11.9% price appreciation. We expect the housing construction to be sustained. We actually pulled this 1.64 down a little bit because of supply constraints, both construction labor and materials such as lumber and copper. But we do expect sustained home building out through the end of our forecast period. In terms of home prices, we think this year again will have an increase of nearly 12% in home prices, again as supply and constrained, and as we have still very strong demand of millennials, especially millennials who are moving into their prime home buying years, who are having children, wanting to move towards the suburbs to larger homes. As interest rates remain low, we still expect considerable home price appreciation, but we expect that home price appreciation to slow down to rates that we saw prior to the pandemic of around 4.6% as we get to 2023. So considerable home price appreciation slowing into 2022 and 2023 as more homes are built, as more people feel comfortable listing their homes for sale. My last piece to close is that we expect moderately higher inflation, but a much faster recovery than we had following the great financial crisis. Because as I showed you, we expect to reach full employment by the end of this forecast period, because we expect to come back to pre-pandemic levels of employment by mid-22, we expect the Fed Reserve to begin tapering its asset purchases. Right now, it's doing 120 billion per month in asset purchases. We expect them to taper that by the end of 2021, most likely announcing this at the Jackson Hole Conference right now this summer, that they will begin tapering at the end of the year. And we expect them to raise rates at the end of 2022. So by the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, that's when we expect the Federal Reserve to begin tightening and to have the first increase in the federal funds rate. This will be consistent with its mission of both full employment and stable prices. This is consistent with a story where we have employment back to pre-pandemic levels, where we have unemployment rate below 4%. And at that point, we do expect the Fed Reserve to begin increasing interest rates. All right, thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Leo. So now let's turn to the California forecast, and let me share my screen here. And let's put that on full screen. So now turning to California, what I would like to do during this presentation is revisit the impact of California's lockdown, California's non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as business closures and stay-at-home orders. We looked at that briefly with some data from the 2018-2019 pandemic about 6 months ago, but now we have some data on the current pandemic and recession that we can look back at that and see what was the impact of that on California relative to other states. So we begin with the image of the Santa Monica Pier being closed and the mass vaccinations at Dodger Stadium, where they were doing thousands per day. And that's the real story of where we are today. So our roadmap, looking at California State 33, going through Ventura County and the Topa Mountains, the first turnout is employment. We'll look at employment and see what's happening there. And then the sectors that are going to influence the trajectory of the California economy over the next 3 years, and then take some time and look at the economic consequences of these stringent non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs, that we've been experiencing here in California relative to, say, Texas and Florida, and then finally finish up with the forecast. So just to dive in first on employment, you see this is non-farm payroll jobs from 2017 through today, and you can see the close up of the economy in March and April of last year. And then it's coming back, but it still has a long ways to go. There are 1.4 million non-farm payroll jobs missing relative to the previous peak. And of course, we've had growth in the potential labor force since then. So where are these lost jobs? This is non-farm payroll job loss by sector from February 2020, prior to the recession, to April. And keep in mind, this is the early April, so it doesn't include the beginning of the opening up that happened in late April. And I've color-coded these in 3 colors. The blues are sectors where we had gains, such as in transportation and warehousing, or very little loss in jobs. And then the red and green are where we had the greatest loss in jobs. In fact, the reds account for 77% of all job loss in California. So that's more than 3/4, and that's leisure and hospitality. Education, the schools are still closed. Other services, those are salons, personal care services, and the like. Administrative services, which is where consultants, temps, and importantly, the people who take care of office buildings are. Retail trade, which was, of course, in trouble in the expansion, and information and healthcare and social services are there in green. So they add another 10% to this. Healthcare and social services is daycare, and information is basically the close up or the end of filming for broadcast movies and streaming services. Let's look at the last 3 months and what's happened. Same color coding. Over on the left, the greatest gain in jobs has been in construction. And this is the boom in housing construction that we've been seeing. And we think this has legs due to the shortage of housing in California. But then we've got a couple of these reds: leisure and hospitality, administrative services, and retail. They're coming back. So greatest job loss, but also those are sectors that are beginning to return. And again, this is back in early April. So we've had a lot more opening up since then. And then healthcare and social services and information. We're starting to see movies being filmed once again, and a return of at least some daycare and some discretionary procedures in healthcare. But a couple of the reds are still basically at zero. Other services, and remember those are personal care services, and education. The schools are still closed. So there's a lot of run room for rapid growth in employment in California. Now, turning to sectors, leisure and hospitality, that was the sector that lost the most jobs. And within leisure and hospitality is tourism. And this is going to depend very much on what happens with domestic tourism and domestic travel, because as you see on the left-hand graph there, international passenger arrivals, that's at LAX in the red and SFO in black there. And they're still down. Well, LAX is down 70% and SFO is about 90%. International tourism is really not coming back, and California is one of the 3 states, along with Florida and New York, that have a large international tourism component to their tourism industry. So that has to be made up by domestic tourists who are not going abroad. The right graphic comes from the North Bay Business Journal, and the squiggly lines that you see there are for each of the 4 counties: Solana, Napa, Marin, and Sonoma. And this is hotel occupancy, and it starts before the pandemic between about the upper 50s to 70%, and it's back there again. So that's wine country. That's primarily domestic tourism. But San Francisco and Los Angeles, where international tourists typically land, it's still down in the 40%. So it remains to be seen how much of that will come back through domestic tourism going to those areas where international tourists were a significant component. So that's leisure and hospitality. In state government, and we've heard about in the governor's latest budget message that the state is flush with cash, this graph excludes government transfers, federal government transfers to the state. It's cumulative general fund revenues. The blue line is 2018 to 2019. The red line is last year, so it begins in July, ends in June, and that's where the pandemic and recession started. And you see it kind of ends up the year just slightly below the previous year, but fairly close. But what's significant is this year, because of the boom in tech in California and because of construction, which you just saw, the general fund revenues are above the previous year. And why that's important is not only because state government doesn't have to contract, it means with Prop 95 funds that the financial support for school openings is there. So when schools can be open and when they will be open, the financial support for rehiring will be there. And remember, that was one of the sectors that lost quite a few jobs and has not returned. So that is some good news. In the housing sector, home sales remain strong. And this goes through April 2021, California Association of Realtors data. And if you just draw this red dashed line across, you see home sales in California are above any time during the last expansion, going all the way back to when financial institutions were blowing out a lot of homes that were foreclosed. And then you have to go back to prior to the Great Recession. So home sales are strong. As you know, home prices are up. That allows developers to make business plans that hunt. And so we're forecasting fairly steady growth in residential construction in California. And in fact, from This year to the end of our forecast, we've got a bit over 15% increase in construction. Relative to 2020, it's a 40% increase. So that's good news in terms of building homes. It's not going to really move the needle when it comes to affordability, but it is going to move the needle in terms of hiring and well-paying jobs. So that's construction. What about logistics? Well, we know about the shift to online shopping and what that's done to logistics, and we're going to talk more about that when we talk about the latest results in the Matkins UCLA Anderson Forecast Commercial Real Estate Survey. But the trade wars are still going on, and the Biden administration has shown no inclination to stop the trade wars or ease them. This is California's seaport traffic through Oakland, Long Beach, and Los Angeles. And you notice imports, which is the top line. Imports have been soaring as we have been going back to work. We've been spending, and part of that spending is going to goods that are manufactured in Asia. The red line at the bottom is exports by sea, and exports have been slightly down. But as other countries start growing once again, we expect that at least to come back to flat. So in spite of the trade wars, the logistics industry is going to be a source of growth. So with that, what I'd like to do is now talk about what these NPIs, these non-pharmaceutical interventions, did to the California economy. And to start off with, at the beginning of the pandemic, so this is February through April of 2020, California's loss of payroll jobs on a percentage basis, which is represented in gold there, was similar to the US, represented in blue. And in those sectors that we looked at, those high human contact sectors, leisure and hospitality, retail, healthcare, and other services, California looked a lot like the US. So you would expect from this that California would grow out of the recession in the same way as the US. But when we look at April 2021 unemployment rates, all the way over on the right in gold is California, second only to Hawaii. And I point out Hawaii because we're going to come back to that. Hawaii basically closed up and is heavily dependent on tourism. So let's keep that in mind. So what happened here? Well, I'd like to go back to something that I showed you all 6 months ago. This is an article by Correa, Luck, and Vernier. And by the way, one of the forecast directs that's on our website is a conversation with Emile Vernier about this and the implications of this for today. So really interesting, and I urge you to go and listen to it or watch it. But the article is called Pandemics Depress the Economy, Public Health Interventions Do Not. Evidence from the 1918 influenza pandemic. And across the horizontal is mortality rates, and across and up the vertical is the change in employment. So higher on the vertical is better economic outcomes. To the left on the horizontal are better health outcomes. The dots represent cities in the US. The red are cities that had fewer or less stringent NPIs, the green more stringent NPIs. And what jumps out at you here is the greens are to the left and above the reds. So the NPIs, the more stringent NPIs resulted in better health outcomes and better economic outcomes. Well, now we have data on 2020. I mean, this is a different pathogen and a different time in economic history, but we have data on 2020. And so the first thing I'd like to look at is Scandinavia, because we've heard a lot about Sweden not locking up, having non-stringent NPIs, and that was a trade-off between the economy and health outcomes. As it turns out, it wasn't a trade-off at all. So this is GDP, real GDP growth on the vertical axis, and infection rates on the horizontal axis. You see Sweden's all the way over on the right with worse health outcomes, but Norway, Finland, and Denmark are at least as good as Sweden in terms of economic outcomes, and maybe better. So that's very similar to the 1918, 1919. The exception is Iceland. Iceland's like Hawaii. It's very dependent on international tourism, and it locked that down. So turning to the US, we have real GDP growth rates for 2020 in the US. The US is in red. This is for states with significant population. And the reason for that is if we included states like North Dakota, where the economy is heavily dependent on extractive industries, you get an increase in oil prices, more oil is being pumped, GDP goes up, but not a lot has really happened. So we want states that are significant in the US economy in terms of their size relative to the US GDP. And this is real GDP growth rates in 2020. All the way over on the right, on the left is Washington, a state that has stringent NPIs. And of course, everyone contracted, but it's the amount of contraction. And then you have Arizona and Colorado, non-stringent NPIs, Georgia that did at least for a while, Virginia, Maryland, and there's California in gold there that did better than Florida, Indiana, and Texas. And these are the states that really held up the US economy such as it was. So it appears that the same kind of thing that we've been seeing has actually happened, and you can see that here. This is all of the large states. Ignore the two at the bottom, Michigan and New York, for the moment. And what you see is the graph looks very much like the earlier one, that states with more stringent NPIs had better health outcomes and better economic outcomes on average than states with less stringent NPIs. And the reason for that is that states with less stringent NPIs created an environment where people who felt that they were at risk or were risk averse, they didn't go to the restaurants, but they also didn't go to Home Depot because they had less confidence in their safety there. And so we get that kind of differential. And of course, there are many other factors at work here. Michigan and New York, we don't really understand New York, but Michigan is the close-up of the auto industry due to supply constraints, nothing to do with NPIs, and the closure of the border with Canada that cut off a lot of tourism to Michigan. So moving on, why is the unemployment rate relatively high if GDP is doing relatively better? What you see here is the contribution to California GDP growth in the 2012 to 2019 period. And those blocks there, so this is by sector, those blocks there that are in this brown are the sectors that had the biggest hit from job loss in the recession. And the ones in blue were the ones that were fairly minor in job loss. Well, during this period, 2012 to 2019, the blues resulted in 3.2% annual growth in GDP in California, and the brown, less than 0.5% growth. And so what we've got here is that the sectors that are really contributing to California's GDP growth are the higher income sectors, and they've been driving the California economy. And those that are really lagging behind have not been driving, at least in the past, the California economy in terms of growth. So that brings us to our summary. The job loss remains concentrated in high human contact sectors due to a variety of reasons, but tech, logistics, and housing and state government will continue to drive California GDP growth faster than US rates. And here are just some numbers. We're going from 5.3% growth in employment. And as the unemployment rate comes down to 4.2%, job growth will slow as well. And 4.2% is fairly close to the US rates. And with housing, we're expecting to get up to 138,000. So just to leave you, we started with Santa Monica Pier, and Santa Monica Pier is now open. So that concludes the California forecast. And let's turn it over to Lila and some new research that you've done on infrastructure and broadband. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jerry. So today I'm going to present a small piece of a larger forecast research project. This is joint work with my colleague, William Yu. The presentation today is going to focus on digital infrastructure, but the larger project is really about very small businesses, or what we're calling micro businesses, not just about broadband. So for today's presentation, we're going to talk about 3 questions. The first is, why study broadband and digital infrastructure at all? And there are a number of possible reasons: the link to health outcomes, the link to educational outcomes, but we specifically consider whether there is a link with economic outcomes. So that leads us to our second question: is there a relationship between broadband and economic outcomes? And again, here there are a number of reasons why we could see this relationship. For example, the technology sector relies on broadband. There could be a third factor driving both economic outcomes and broadband, or the possibility we want to consider is that this relationship could be driven by online business startups. Which leads us to our third question: are online businesses helping the economy through their prevalence, or how many of them there are, and or the intensity of their activity? And here is where we are going to bring in a new set of data to answer this question. So to our first question, why study broadband and digital infrastructure in the first place? Well, let's take a look at what we are measuring. This map is showing you the fraction of households across the US with a broadband internet subscription at the county level, where blue colors mean higher value, so a higher proportion of households with broadband access, and red colors indicate lower values. And you can see a couple of patterns in the counties. Counties in the Northeast tend to have higher fractions of broadband access, as do counties along the West Coast. And there is a higher concentration of counties in the South that have lower broadband subscription rates. Now, digital infrastructure isn't just about broadband. Computers matter as well. This chart is showing you a scatter plot with each dot being one US county, with computer ownership on the horizontal axis and broadband subscriptions, or the broadband subscription rate, on the vertical axis. For reference, that dashed green line is the 45-degree line. And what you can see is there is a very strong positive correlation between the two. So today we're going to focus on broadband. Now, specifically to our question, why focus on broadband? Well, first, this chart is showing you the percent of people with a broadband subscription across a number of countries. And you can see that the US is in the middle. And access to broadband is at least one of the reasons why broadband access and expanding broadband access appears to be, or seems to be, a political priority at both the national and at the state level. So the Biden administration has included broadband investment in various proposals for their infrastructure bill. But where this ultimately ends up and what number we'll end up seeing is unclear at this point. The initial proposal was for about 100 billion. Then there was talk of 65 billion. But regardless of what number we get to, this does indicate that it's a priority for the White House. Also, at the state level, the May revision to Governor Newsom's budget proposed spending $7 billion on broadband infrastructure. So we want to ask why this is the case. There are many reasons why broadband matters. We're just going to highlight a very few. One is e-commerce. So e-commerce is growing, and e-commerce relies on broadband, both on the buyer and on the seller side. This chart is showing you year-over-year growth rates of US retail sales for total retail sales. That's the blue line with triangles. And specifically for e-commerce sales, that's the red line with circles. And what you can see is that the red line is always above the blue line. So growth rates are higher for e-commerce sales than they are for total retail sales. And this was especially the case during the pandemic, where we saw retail sales fall, but online e-commerce sales actually increase. Another possible reason why broadband is important is the potential link to health outcomes. In his report last quarter, my colleague William Yu found that after controlling for various variables, counties with more broadband and computer access had a lower COVID-19 mortality rate. And that result is summarized in this scatter plot here, where again, the blue dots are US counties. On the horizontal axis is computer access, and on the vertical axis is the COVID-19 mortality rate. And you can see a negative correlation there. So we're not saying with certainty what exactly the reason is behind this relationship. There are many possibilities, including that computer and broadband access could allow better access to information about health, or could improve the quality and accessibility of telehealth visits. There are many possible reasons, but we do see this relationship. Another possible reason why broadband matters is the potential link to economic outcomes, and that's what we want to address now. So specifically, we ask the question, is there a relationship between broadband and economic outcomes? And we find that the answer is yes. You can see this looking at a simple scatter plot. These blue dots, again, are US counties, and we're looking at the correlation between broadband subscriptions on the horizontal axis and the unemployment rate in March 2021 on the vertical axis. And you can see that there's a negative relationship there. More broadband access, lower unemployment rates. But there's a lot of scatter around this red best fit line, and that's indicating that other factors matter as well in helping understand this relationship. So what we do is that we run a regression model where we include some of these other factors, such as human capital, measures of educational attainment, including median income, population density, measures of labor market strength before and during the pandemic, and cases and deaths from the pandemic per capita. And even when we include these extra variables, we still find a negative correlation or a negative relationship between broadband access and labor markets. Now, the question is, why do we see this? For this, one reason we would like to propose is that having access to broadband enables online businesses to start up and thrive, and that these businesses help local economies. For this to be the story, we need it to be the case, or we need to see if areas with more broadband also have more online businesses. Here again, we find that the answer is yes. This is showing you the correlation where, again, blue dots are counties between the density of online microbusinesses on the vertical axis and broadband subscriptions on the horizontal axis. Now, I want to back up and talk about how we measure and how we define online microbusinesses. We define online microbusinesses as small businesses that use a website for their business operations. And we measure these online microbusinesses through a partnership with GoDaddy. GoDaddy is a company that sells domain names and website services. And the data we have are from their database of individuals who have purchased a domain name, and also about website characteristics that are linked to those domain names. In terms of quantity, we're talking about a lot of business owners and a lot of businesses, about 11 million individuals who have about 40 million domain names. And this forms our data set of online microbusinesses that we will be using in our analysis today. So before we go too much further, let's take a look at what the data look like across space. This is a map of GoDaddy's density, or the density of GoDaddy's online microbusinesses from March of 2021. And density means number of residents or number of microbusinesses per 100 residents. So you can see counties in the Northeast tend to have a higher density, as do counties on the West Coast. And there's a smattering of counties in the middle of the country with both more and less, or more and fewer microbusinesses per 100 people. So now to our last question, are online microbusinesses helping the local economy? And the short answer based on our analysis is yes. So what we do to answer this question is we look at 3 different measures of labor market outcomes, and these represent different ways of understanding the relationship between microbusinesses and the economy. We control for a number of factors, but the takeaway is that across these models, we find that there's a positive relationship between online microbusinesses and labor market strength. Now, up until this point, we've just been looking at the amount or the prevalence of these online microbusinesses, and we want to know if we can learn more by considering how active or how intensively active these businesses are. So what we do is to build a microbusiness index. And we want this index to capture the 3 components that we believe are important about online microbusinesses. And those 3 factors are receptivity, which is the physical and intellectual infrastructure needed to access and use the internet. Reception, which you can think of as the extensive margin, capturing the quantity or the prevalence, specifically the number of GoDaddy online microbusinesses created by residents in each location. And finally, activity. And you can think of this as the intensive margin. How intensively active are these microbusinesses? And specifically the frequency of owner and customer use and access of these websites. So we create one composite index using variables that we have mapped to these 3 concepts, but we also create 3 sub-indices, one for receptivity using the variables we have identified as capturing receptivity, one for reception, and one for activity. So let's take a look at the time series pattern of our index and our sub-indices. So this is showing you time series pattern, and what you can see is that each index and sub-index picks up a different pattern over time. And we want to highlight the activity index, which is in red with triangles. And what seems to be going on is that this index is picking up business activity that looks to correspond with the waves of the pandemic infection and also an increase in online holiday shopping towards the end of 2020. Now, this is suggestive that the index will be important and useful going forward for understanding economic outcomes. What about across space? This map is showing you our composite index for counties across the US in March 2021. Similar patterns jump out: higher values of our index along the Northeast, higher values of the index along the West Coast, and lower values of the index in the South. Now we want to get to our last question: is the relationship between online microbusinesses and economic outcomes driven by the prevalence or quantity or the activity of these microbusinesses? So what we do here is we take those same 3 regressions we ran before and just add our microbusiness index. And what we find is that across 2 of the 3 specifications, that the microbusinesses and our microbusiness index provides additional explanatory power over and above what we learned by including the density or a prevalence measure of these microbusinesses. And what that means is that by creating an index, we get more nuance and more information about the relationship between labor markets, economic outcomes, microbusinesses, and possibly why we're seeing that relationship. Or another way to put this is that the activity or intensive margin seems to matter. It's not just about the number of microbusinesses, but how active they are. This is an important finding which supports our future research and our continuing research on this topic. So to conclude, based on our analysis and our research, we believe that digital infrastructure and broadband have a positive impact on economic outcomes, and that this positive impact is driven in part by online microbusinesses. But importantly, there are many factors that contribute to the success of online microbusinesses, and broadband is just one of them. So we encourage you to look out for our full report on our research, which will be out and freely available to the public later this summer, where the focus of this report is really understanding these online microbusinesses and their relationship to the economy and what helps them thrive. So thank you for your attention today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lila. And William's report is going to be available soon. And this is part of some ongoing research. So really looking forward to what else you discover. We have a little bit of time for questions, really only about 10 minutes. And we have two of our brilliant MBA students from the Real Estate Association here with us, and they've been monitoring your Slido questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Allison and Cody to moderate the Q&A with the forecast team.
Thank you for the introduction, Jerry, and thank you to all of our presenters and the brilliant questions that we have. So the first question is pertaining to inflation. So how would you factor in the significantly increased money supply, which is sort of unprecedented in times, into your inflation calculations? And second, on that same note, sustained inflation is considered by many as the biggest risk to economic recovery. And it appeared that sort of the transitory inflation was, just going to be short term, but is there any data to support that this inflation is just transitory as opposed to, here to stay for a while?
Sure. So let me answer the second question first, which is sustained inflation. Is there any data to support that it's transitory? And I'll flip it and I'll say that there is no data to support that it will be sustained, right? So right now we've gotten a data point, 1 month of data, indicating that we're going to have, some factors that are having increases in price levels. And when you actually break it down, you see that where we're seeing increases in price levels isn't broad-based. It's on a few items related to especially leisure travel, where we're seeing some of these largest spikes. So this is one of the places that we don't expect that to be sustained, right? We expect that to normalize over time, especially, if you look at some of the price indices that I showed. It was looking at airfare rebounding to pre-pandemic levels. It was looking at lodging rebounding to pre-pandemic levels, right? So, it's too soon to say that we are going to have sustained rates of inflation. We don't have enough data coming in. That's a paradigm shift from where we've been in the last 10 years. And if we do get several months of data that show broad-based inflation across several different categories, then we'll likely need to update our forecast. But right now, that's too soon. The other point that I'd like to make there is that inflation expectations remain anchored. When we look at the 5-year forward inflation expectations by market participants 5 years from now, they're still expecting 2.2%, right? So it doesn't seem that market participants are expecting this takeoff at inflation. And that's important because a lot of inflation is about self-fulfilling prophecies. If people believe there will be higher inflation, they start raising prices, consumers are willing to pay higher prices, and then inflation becomes self-sustaining, but inflation expectations remain anchored. Very quickly on the money supply. It's not just money supply, it's the velocity of money that matters. So money supply is up, velocity of money is down. And historically, while there has been a relationship between money supply and inflation back in, the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, we've really seen a breakdown of that relationship over these past 30 years, where the higher money supply isn't really leading to higher inflation. And that's because of this velocity parameter. The velocity of money has gone down.
Yeah, that's because we're buying things in a different way than we did then. David, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Well, I'm going to take the other side of the trade, so to speak, because all inflations begin as transitory. That's what everybody says in the beginning. And if you look at the ISM surveys, you have like 90%, close to 90% of the participants reporting higher prices. That's broad-based. You look at Costco. Costco was saying thousands of SKUs. They're seeing major increases compared to like 2 months ago. You're seeing it in a whole host of consumer commodities. You're seeing it in meat. So I think it's more broad-based. And if you don't look at money supply so much, if you want to look at the huge increase in savings, 2 trillion above trend, already there, you look at the gigantic fiscal stimulus. So if you have all the ingredients to have something that's going to be more than transitory. So I would be much higher than the forecast if I had to do it today. However, I do agree there are transitory elements. I don't think it will be sustained forever. You know, it won't be like the rerun of the 1970s. But I could see numbers year over year on the order of 4 to 6%. I mean, we're 4% right now on CPI year over year, and there's base year effects. But I think we will have a run rate of somewhere in the 4 to 5, 6% range on a month over month basis, forgetting about year over year. So I think that we're going to see more of it. And I think the Fed is going to wait, so the market may ultimately perceive that the Fed is behind because they've told us they're not going to be preemptive. And yeah, monetary policy works for the leg, so we're going to see what happens. So I would think there'll be more rather than less than what's in the forecast, but not 1970s style inflation.
So higher for longer, but not a takeoff in inflation where we get to double digits.
No. But to me is we'll have a shock to if we see sustained 4% inflation, or use 4, my low end number, that will be a shock to the financial markets.
Mm-hmm.
So it won't be, you don't have to get to double digits to shock the markets because everybody's really on the other side of the trade. And that's what's showing the 5 over 5, because the market believes the Fed is going to stay easy forever. And that's why the 5 year over 5 year is showing what it is.
Okay, Allison, what's our next question?
Yeah, so this one kind of talks about the protesting and the civil disturbance that happened last year. So are there any short run or even some lasting economic effects of the protests and civil disturbances in LA back in April and May, June of 2020? And kind of what would, how are we going to get out that? How are we going to restore some of those businesses that, were subject of those civil disturbances?
So I guess I'll take that one. In the aggregate, when we have seen civil disturbances in the past, we haven't seen much in the way of an impact, much if any, in the way of an impact on aggregate economic activity. But for local communities, that's not true. And so if one thinks back to the time of the Watts riots, for example, it took a long time for those neighborhoods to recover their economic activity, and some neighborhoods didn't. And to some extent, you see things like food deserts happening in areas where grocery stores were looted and then they didn't open up again. So there is very localized impact, but it really didn't enter into our forecast. And we have no data to suggest that, for the California economy, for the US economy, even for the Los Angeles economy, that you can see it in the numbers, even though if you go to the areas that were impacted, you definitely do see it.
So at the macro level, I think we now have a little bit more focus on race and inequality than we did prior to the Black Lives Matter protests that happened last year. And so even at the Fed Reserve, there's been a lot of focus, not just on the unemployment rate, but on the unemployment rate of African Americans. There was a paper by Dr. Lisa Cook looking at the untapped potential because of discrimination, both gender and race discrimination. And so I think that we're having a lot more investment in sectors and in population groups that have been historically discriminated. And that might actually lead to not only more investment in these populations, more productivity among these populations, but being able to pool more people and making them more productive as they come into the workforce.
Okay, and I think we may have time for one more question.
Okay, so thank you, Jerry. On one hand, we have inflation applying pressure to the labor markets, and on the other hand, we have employees demanding higher wages, and we've seen that employees are kind of slower to come back to work right now. And we also know that in the past, in times of crises, that oftentimes prompts companies to innovate. So do we think there could be greater risk in terms of employment opportunities from, let's say, like in the service industry of restaurants, implementing possibly, keeping the QR codes that would, possibly replace servers and hostesses and things like that, or even just the technology you'd see at fast food restaurants and McDonald's? Do we think that's a serious, maybe medium-term risk?
Yeah, exactly. So there is, I didn't present it during the slides, but in the write-up, you'll see a chart that talks about rising wages, but also rising labor productivity so that the unit costs actually remain flat, right? And so this is our expectation. Like, yes, wages are going up in leisure and hospitality, but you're also seeing, to your point, people using QR codes to order, to check out, right? People doing mobile ordering and just stopping by a restaurant to pick up so that you have fewer cashiers, right? And so yes, we might have higher wages, but we have this compensating effect, which is more productivity, which means at the end of the day, lower unit labor costs. We need to have some of this happen anyway, because we're having boomers aging into retirement, and we have a smaller population that's going to be supporting a smaller population of workers supporting a larger population of retirees. So the way that we have to do that is the existing population of workers have to become more productive. And that happens partly through productivity and innovation.
Yeah, so I'm going to add some pessimism to this, which I think was the nature of the question, which is in the service industry, I think you are going to see exactly what you described. And that means that restaurants are going to have fewer employees, for example. It means that in these low-income sectors, there's going to be long-term unemployment. And so that is a social and policy issue, because unless those who are forced into long-term unemployment because of automation in the service industry, which we're really starting to see now, the kind of transformation that we saw in manufacturing before, unless they are able to transition to the kind of work that requires a different set of skills, they're going to be unemployed for a long period of time. And so that is a social issue. And I think, the productivity gain that you see in our forecast is reflective of that. That's kind of not there, but we might be too optimistic in terms of the return in the number of jobs in leisure and hospitality, for example. And I think that brings us to time for the break. We are going to restart at 9:55, so a chance to stretch your legs. And then we have a great keynote coming up, and we'll see you at 9:55 to learn about the future of the office. Thank you. Welcome back to the second part of our program. And in this part of our program, we're going to be focusing on commercial real estate. And it is a pleasure to have with us our Dean, Tony Bernardo, Dean of the UCLA Anderson School of Management. And Tony, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jerry. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Andy Cohen, the co-CEO of Gensler. I should also say that we're privileged at Anderson to have a long and productive relationship with Andy himself and with Gensler, his company, which played a huge role in the newest addition to the Anderson campus, Marian Anderson Hall. Andy is one of two Gensler co-CEOs whose collaborative leadership is fundamental to setting the company apart as a leading design firm. For his innovative leadership, Andy, along with co-CEO Diane Hoskins, ranks on Business Insider's elite creators list, a who's who of the world's 100 top creative visionaries. And Gensler has also been recognized by Fast Company as one of the world's most innovative companies. As a hands-on leader, Andy oversees Gensler's global platform and its day-to-day operations. More than 6,300 people working together across 50 offices, serving clients in more than 120 countries. A champion of design, resiliency, and sustainability, Andy is a leader of Gensler's Design and Innovation Committee, directing and spearheading design excellence strategies across Gensler's diverse practice areas. Andy is a Pratt Institute alumnus and fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He's also an active Young Presidents Organization Gold member and a board member of the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Welcome, Andy, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Tony. Really appreciate the opportunity to present really workplace of the future. Miriam, would you put the deck up, please? And as Tony mentioned, this cover slide really is a fantastic project that we completed with Tony and UCLA Anderson. You could see this is the interior of the new Anderson School addition that sits on top of the parking structure. And so we're so thrilled when I talk about workplace of the future, your own building is a workplace of the future. And I hope you all get to see it. It was built right during COVID. So today I'm going to be presenting to you Gensler's strategies. Every year we come out with what we call design forecast, and we focus on strategies for workplace of the future. And this year in particular, strategies for in a post-COVID world. Next slide. So I'll take you through some observations and some research. We have what's called the Gensler Research Institute, and we provide insights to our clients around the world. And what we did is we solicited and went out and surveyed our clients, 67,000 clients, major clients around the world. And what came back was from the survey about COVID and what the post workplace is going to be like is what came back from being home was, if you look up here, is, virtual is not real. Recorded is not live. We really need live experiences, visceral experiences, right? Our physical space is our culture's town hall, our town square, Main Street and community center. And I could tell you, I have the opportunity of meeting with many, many CEOs. And that's the biggest thing that's missing here is that culture, the ability to communicate with people directly and create experiences with people live and not being stuck in this Zoom world that we're in. We're working with a lot of developers right now on how to prepare their buildings and welcome tenants back, which is obviously occurring right now. And you can see we're talking to major tenants, and I'll take you through what they had to say. Next slide, please. So we did it in our survey. We asked major tenants in the US and around the world what they're planning to do in a post-COVID world. And I'll direct you to the first column, permanent remote working, and the last column, structural change to your workplace strategy. It's a question I get often is the workplace going to change radically? And so you could see from these major tenants in the world, Microsoft, one of the biggest users in the world, unlikely permanent remote working, unlikely, and no to structural change in the workplace strategy. Or Wells Fargo, likely to increase the number of employees that will work remotely. So some of these companies are saying, yes, there'll be hybrid employees working remotely, but will there be a structural change for Wells Fargo? Unlikely. Netflix, a major client of ours that we're working with around the globe, limited leadership prefers supervised workforce. And then this is really important. I'll talk about this in a minute. They're projecting an increase in square footage per person. Over the last 10 years, there's been a decrease in square foot per person. Now there's going to be an increase in square foot per person. Or Oracle, the culture and collaboration are way too important. This is what we're hearing from all these different clients. Way, way too important is collaboration. A slight increase in remote working. And with the structural change, they're going to probably make a furniture change in their workplace. Next slide. And I'm showing you all this to show you real time what our clients are saying. AT&T, another major space user in the United States, limited change in permanent remote work, strong preference for supervised workforce, unlikely structural change. Facebook, which Mr. Zuckerberg came out early in the pandemic and said work from home and said that could have 50% of the workforce working remotely in the next 10 years. But really, in reality, what we're seeing is Facebook is now leasing more and more space. So it's interesting that they're shifting as this 15-month pandemic has gone on. And structural change to your workplace strategy, less dense environments, and I'm going to come back to that soon too. Again, rolling on from client to client, Boeing likely to see a more shift in work short term, but no structural changes. So you could see generally major tenants in the marketplace saying they don't see this permanent. They see a hybrid workforce, but they don't see this permanent shift to working from home. Next slide, please. And so I get asked a lot at these conferences about what the future looks like. And for a while, the arrow on the left was saying that with the workforce, with remote flexibility, that we will need less office space. That's been the supposition for the first 6 months of the pandemic. But what we're seeing, and my firm designs millions and millions of square feet around the world, was seeing clients coming to us saying, well, maybe we need some less space because of remote work and working from home in a hybrid work environment. but we're going to need more space for de-densification. If you think about it, in the workforce, the square foot per person has gone down to something like 75 or 80 square feet per person from 200 square feet 10 years ago. And now we're seeing the reversal of that. Less densification, more space per person, and that's going to increase space needs that's required out in the marketplace. Next slide. And what we've been saying as designers in the workplace is designing for the human experience. You know, visceral experiences, real experiences has never been more important than right now as people are going back to their offices. Next slide. So we have in our research institute, we just came back, we called the City Pulse Survey. And we went around the world to 20 different cities and asked, what do you think about the key issues? What are the key issues from urban residents around relocating? Why would you relocate? And as you know, there's been a significant amount of relocation that's occurred in the US from urban to suburban as an example. But these 5 considerations came back as the most important. The first one on external or up is neighborhood design. Neighborhoods that are beautiful, authentic, and clean, that prioritize pedestrians over cars is what people are looking for. You just heard it from Leo and Jerry. Employment opportunities, positive and increasing opportunities for job growth and career advancement. Transportation options, really key, multimodal approach to transportation that also includes micro mobility options for people to traverse through urban environments. And then the biggest issues that came back, big city problems. Cities are too big, they're too crowded, they're too noisy, and those that are losing their cultural heritage. And the other major negative, and this is probably the biggest one of all, is affordability challenges. And we certainly heard this through major US cities and neighborhoods that are becoming less affordable and where residents struggle to save. So, you know, this is what we just got back from our research in City Pulse of these 5 key considerations. Next slide. So now I'm going to take you through, over the course of the pandemic, our research institute has done several surveys, and we reached out and discussed what people are really looking for as they were sitting at home. And I'll caveat this with, the surveys were done just recently where, you know, again, people are working from home, and we're going to do another survey the minute people start to go back to work, and we're going to compare the results. Next slide. And what we looked across, looked across a wide variety, a potpourri of different types of users, from the role they have in a firm, from senior leadership to professional staff to managers, to on the bottom left, generations. We cut across millennials, Gen X, baby boomers pretty equally, industries, all these different industries we surveyed, and then their living situations, which are so important to emphasize, again, people that were living alone versus people that were living with kids under 5 years old or 5 to 12, and then other people that were living with adults. And this was the results of the surveys that came back. Next slide. So how and where do office workers want to work in a post-pandemic future? That's been the question for the last 15 months. Next slide. And this slide really shows the results. And the results that came back were that about 19% said they want to work full-time from home, 1 in 5 people. But 52%, that center section, said they want to work in a hybrid environment. And that means either 1 or 2 days from home or 3 or 4 days from home, but a hybrid, whether it be working at home and also working at, obviously, in the office. And then close to 30% of people said, no, I want to go back, and I want to go back full time. I can't work. I have kids at home that haven't been in school, been going to school, or I have, adult parents, or I have roommates and I can't get my work done. I want to go back to the office. So this is fascinating. This is the results from people as they were home answering the survey. Next slide. So this shows you comparison by industry. And as you go through the industry, you see some industries like consumer goods are saying they want to be back in the office, whereas, say, technology are saying, you know what, they could be more full-time at home. And you hear this, coders in technology could say they could work at home, they can get their work done at home. But you could see the difference as you cut across all these industries of what people are saying, and they're very different from different types of work and roles that people perform. Next slide. This is another key part of the survey, which is workers are asking for more access to privacy. And that's what I mentioned in my opening about square foot per person. And And what they're saying is these big open plans that a lot of people were sitting in are now changing. And then I'll show you examples of this later on in the presentation of creating choice for people. People want to come back, but they want to come back with choice of either private offices, as you're seeing on here, mostly private or semi-private, to somewhat open, but not those big open plans that we were all sitting in before the pandemic. And my firm is actually looking at these open plans and changing them. And I'll show you some configurations on how that's viewed today. But this is a really important shift that people are saying they don't want to go back to those big open plans with ubiquitous desks, lines and lines of desks lined up. What they want to go back to is a sense of choice. They want living room settings, they want den settings, they want places where they have a sense of choice to work throughout the day. Next slide. And again, cutting across the industries, how many days would you prefer to work from the office versus home? And you could see cutting across, these different industries, what you'd feel in mostly open versus mostly private. You could see the legal industry saying, look, I want to be mostly private. I do not want to be in an open environment versus, say, finance versus consumer goods or technology. Next slide. So the big conclusion is that working from home for all of us has supported the ability to focus for most people who don't, have, kids at home that aren't disturbed by their roommates. People feel like they can focus more at home, and that, workers are asking for more access to privacy in the workplace when they come back. But the future workplace must deal with the competing pressures of increasing flexibility, more choice, while also increasing privacy. Next slide. So what is the purpose of the office? Next slide, and I've been talking about it all along. I can't emphasize enough that the culture of an organization does not come through the mission and culture. The feeling of camaraderie does not come through in this Zoom environment. The mentoring and training, especially people in my firm, many people joined my firm during COVID, and they have had a bear of a time getting mentored and coaching and training because they haven't been with all the people that they need to nurture them. And this whole idea of health-work balance, and the biggest one of all, and I'll talk about this a lot, is collaboration. Because collaboration happens in spurts on Zoom, but what you're not getting is the true collaboration of meetings before meetings and meetings after meetings and meeting at the water cooler and interacting with your fellow worker. Next slide. So I'll talk briefly because we did the survey around the world. And as you know, I'm not talking about the pandemic at all right now. I'm talking about China going back earlier than any other country because they were able to recover from the pandemic earlier. We have offices in Shanghai and Beijing and Hong Kong, and China was able to go back. So we've been measuring since last February, March, and it's really interesting to see what's happened in China. Next slide. And if you look in your upper right, what came back is in China, different culture than the US, but still 87% of the model in China is hybrid, with 47% of people working from home 1 or 2 days a week and 40% 3 or 4 days a week. But it's definitely been a hybrid workforce in China. And we'll see as it traverses across the world, the rest of the snapshots in the US, you could see 52% of people have been working from home, or 48% in the UK, or 48% in Australia. Next slide. So what have we gained during the pandemic and what have we lost? Next slide. And I won't go through all these, but I'll go through a few of these. And this slide is interesting. What have we gained and what have we lost? And if you look at focus and flow in the center of the slide, people are saying, what have we gained? I can focus better at home because it's a controlled environment. But on the other hand, the ability to focus at the office without kids and pets and family that are distracting me has been a major, major issue during COVID. And if you look at the last box, social and culture, I have deeper connections with my immediate team. And that's what's come through Zoom, that people do feel closer with their immediate team. But the problem is they're totally disconnected from the culture of an organization and their colleagues not on their team. And people feel very disenchanted and different, feeling that they're not really plugged into their organizations. Next slide. This is a major important part of our research, which showed in 2019, pre-COVID, 43% of people were collaborating and 47% were doing focus work. In any office, approximately half were collaborating and half were focusing. And you can see how much collaboration has fallen off through the Zoom world that we live in to 27% or 37% in collaboration. And that's why you feel this feeling of working from home in the Zoom world. You feel you're burnt out because you're not having those true collaboration moments. That's what's really come away with. Yet the focus work at home has increased. Next slide. And then we asked questions like activities that have been done better at the workplace. And again, collaboration comes in the highest. It's much, much easier to do it in the workplace. Staying up to date on what others are working on, again, much easier to do at the workplace and so forth. So from the idea of what's hardest to do at home, nurturing connections, building social capital, ideation, innovation. And innovation happens when you have a diversity of ideas in a more of a brainstorming environment, not a Zoom environment that's controlled, and mentoring and learning. Next slide. And this slide shows mentorship and coaching, which I just mentioned, which has been so lacking during these last 15 months, from senior leadership and executives really having a problem mentoring and coaching their people that report to them, managers and directors, major issues and so forth. So, the junior staff are significantly less likely to have participated in coaching, and they are disconnected. The younger people, the millennials, are disconnected, and the millennials are more than 50% of the workforce today. So more than 50% of our workplace is disconnected because they haven't been mentored and coached during this pandemic. Next slide. And this is a great one. I actually just wrote an article that got published in Forbes, and it was on FOMO, the fear of missing out. And this is what you're going to see when people start to go back to the office. It's those spontaneous moments of connection, a meeting before the meeting. Think of how many meetings you have right now, but you don't have that chance to shake someone's hand or say hello to someone and find out what's really on their mind before the meeting or after the meeting. And the second one is definitely video fatigue going on, and it's very, very real. And the culture doesn't translate from the screen to the office. And I'll show you how we're designing spaces now to accommodate that. Next slide. So the workplace is crucial for, as I've mentioned, collaboration, culture, and productivity. Next slide. And so we Gensler, we came out, our research institute came out with Design Forecast 2021. If you have an opportunity, you can go on our website and see. We literally dissect each industry in real estate, and we talk about the strategies in a post-COVID world. And really the idea of rediscovering, the big takeaway is we're rediscovering what human connection is all about. Next slide. So these four considerations are really coming true in a post-pandemic world. The first one is the desire to reconnect. And you heard it from Leo, you heard it from Jerry and those predictions that were coming out on GDP. People really want to get back. They really want to reconnect, and that's going to drive the recovery. The focus on health must include climate change. This pandemic has been a wake-up call for climate change, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but can't emphasize enough how important this is on dealing with the bigger issue coming at us over the next 10 years, which we're going to have to solve, which is climate change. Or prioritizing the human experience that makes sure that it's not just about the data or the surveys, but it's about the human experience, so creating those visceral experiences. And reimagining the future of cities, and I'll talk a lot about that, and the next generation of places and spaces. Next slide. So first, the desire to be together, to get out of this Zoom world is driving the recovery. And what we're finding is design matters a lot. That design is creating places where they prioritize human experience, and that where our clients are saying to us right now that our buildings, our interiors, our workplaces are magnets for drawing talent. And right now there is a talent war going on out there, and people want to work in environments that are conducive for learning, conducive for innovation, conducive to culture. And the opportunity is immense right now in the real estate world. And you're going to start seeing major organizations do major shifts in their workplace design because of it. Next slide. I just mentioned this, and I can't emphasize it enough, that the global health crisis we went through it's definitely a wake-up call to climate change. This cartoon kind of sums it up that, COVID-19 hit, and obviously the recession was right on its heels, but climate change over the next 10 years in us solving and getting behind and understanding and getting behind what the issues are in climate change are a key consideration. In real estate, and most people don't realize this, 40% of all CO2 emissions are buildings. And so it's our responsibility in the real estate industry to deal with climate change. And what we're seeing is it's going to be mandated in California, it's going to be mandated in the US, that over the next 10 years, really over the next 5 years, most buildings are going to have to be net zero. And that means not taking energy from the grid, but creating their own energy, net neutral in energy creation. And places that do not support sustainability, and we're hearing this from workers throughout the United States, will lose value because people refuse to occupy buildings, for example, that are hermetically sealed, that don't have outside air, that don't have the right amount of air changes, that don't have the latest systems to support sustainability. Next slide. Next, and this shows you, and I won't go through it right now, but people ask, what is net zero? What does that mean? And you could see these are the 10 steps to really getting to net zero, from understanding the building's energy performer, to creating your budget, to orienting buildings the right way, to using energy modeling while buildings are being designed or for existing buildings, and introducing shoulder shading. So as we go through this, you could see these are the 10 considerations to get to net zero. They're going to be so important in the real estate industry moving forward over the next 5 and 10 years. You can see this slide talks about embodied energy. And this really, people don't realize this, but embodied energy means what does it take to make a material, not just to install it, but what does it take to make a material? And you're going to be hearing way more about this, and you could see how much steel and concrete dominate embodied energy. And this is going to be so important as we design buildings of the future that deal with CO2 emissions, will be the embodied energy in materials. You can see that obviously some other materials that you would think would be high aren't that high, but look at furniture and chairs alone, very high in CO2. Next slide. And another key consideration is design solutions that, as I mentioned before, that prioritize the human experience, that really talk about holistic design. Here you could see, and I'll show you many examples of buildings that now have inside-outside spaces, outside decks for meetings, for collaborations. Next slide. And fourth consideration, and it's a big one, is we're redefining the future of cities over the next generation. And if you look over the pandemic, what we found is that cities are really about 20-minute neighborhoods. And what does that mean? That people have been able to get their needs met within 20 minutes walking distance of their home. And that means medical needs, that means grocery, that means schools, it means everything you need within 20-minute neighborhoods. And so we're seeing cities around the United States dealing with this issue, that within cities, there are districts and neighborhoods that have been dealing with this interconnected 20-minute neighborhood. Also, what's happened during the pandemic is the public realm, which used to be dominated by cars, has now been taken over by people. And you've seen from LA to New York to Minneapolis to Atlanta, entire city streets taken over and away from the car and towards people, because the sidewalks are so narrow. People needed places to stroll, places to dine and eat. In cities like LA and New York, we took over parking stalls, and those became the outside dining areas. And a lot of cities right now are saying, you know what, they work so well, we're going to be keeping those outside dining areas. So the public realm, taking our city streets back for people, is so much about the future of cities that we're moving towards. Next slide. So how do we rethink buildings in the physical workplace for the post-pandemic future? Next slide. So I'm going to show you a series of examples where you're going to see that there's a sense of choice. These projects were completed during COVID and or completing right now. And what we've done is we redesigned them to provide different places for people to sit and work. Obviously, the photograph on the left is lots of different seating environments. Photographed on the left, whether it's banquettes or open seating, the ability for people to work in different types of environments. Next slide. Technology, a major consideration coming up, the use of your your cell phone as a way to navigate buildings, or major displays for technology or what's taking place in buildings will be very, very important in, creating that compelling connected experiences. Next slide. Or the example that it's no longer that open plan with those rows and rows of desks. You're going to have much more variety of seating groups on your right. Or we designed Instagram headquarters on your left, where you'll have specific check-in areas and seating areas, but also the idea that the firm's culture is right there out in front of you. Next slide. We've designed over COVID a lot of indoor-outdoor spaces, buildings that were hermetically sealed and now have sliding doors that open up. This is a building in downtown LA where we literally took out the windows on the outside of the building. We created sliding doors with the ability that they're indoor and outdoor spaces. And it really, people love these spaces coming back to you that have outside air, that have the ability to work inside or outside. Bringing the outside in, you can see on the shot on the right, being located on the ground floor with sliding doors that open up, or major kitchen and cafes that are located on the ground floor. Next slide. And we're going to be seeing this idea of equitable digital experiences. The idea that you can have a 3-person conference and one of the people is not there. And you're going to see conference rooms with lots of cameras, the ability to really come in tighter on people, the ability to share presentations in this hybrid mode where people won't feel disconnected in the hybrid environment of working from home. Next slide. And lots of variety in the workplace, from conference rooms on the left with 2 and 3 people in closed conference rooms so you can get quiet work done, or to open area conferencing areas with whiteboards where people have the ability to not just sit at their desk all day, but to come together and collaborate. Next slide. Or again, more examples of how people coming together. We're designing lots of cafes and kitchens on your right where people are going to come together, or big whiteboarded areas in the workplace where people can come in a protected area to come and meet and brainstorm. Next slide. Again, all these were done during COVID, just to give you an idea on what changed during COVID to accommodate COVID. On the left is a corporate headquarters, and you can see the variety of seating that's to accommodate different settings. Staircases instead of using elevators to connect from floor to floor, offices and conference rooms with more lounge seating, lounge environment in them versus just desks and chairs. Next slide. So when we went to our clients, these are the 4 key areas that we see in the reimagined future. The first one is flexible working, to have agile offices that accommodate diverse business needs. And as I showed you, the hybrid work models. Touchless solutions, the idea of your personal devices, your phones, will become central to your employees' interactions with each other and their environments. From checking in the lobby to checking out a conference room to going in the elevator and knowing what floor you're going to, technology is going to enable this idea of a touchless environment where you won't have to touch doors or open doors and things like that. Wellness and focus, obviously health and safety are continued priorities, and smart technologies being incorporated in a lot of ways in the buildings we're designing right now. And then culture and community. I've mentioned this many times. The workplace is no longer this fiscal environment, but a multimodal collection of spaces that support multiple lifestyles, that have different modes of working or where you can work. Next slide. Again, this is an example of agile office that boosts productivity. This is Netflix headquarters that we finished in Hollywood. And it has many indoor and outdoor spaces that are conducive. It has smart design in the lobby that allows you to check into any space. Next slide. Here's that example of one of their outdoor environments. So it's collaboration spaces, big sliding doors that open, outside air, collaborating outside. Next slide. And as I mentioned, the touchless environment, you're going to be able to leverage voice and texture technologies where you'll wave your hand and a door will open. All bathrooms will be touchless and frictionless as an example. We're designing all those right now. The mobile device, you can see on your right-hand side, there's now being discussions around having a mobile vaccine passport that will be loaded on your phone. The ability to check in and know exactly where you're going in the building so you don't have to touch those elevator buttons. Or using your phone to be able to order food and have it delivered directly to your offices. As I mentioned, elevator access has been a major issue during COVID, and floor selection, and you're going to see much more in elevator technology that's going to allow you to take you directly to your floor, and so forth. Next slide. As I mentioned, your phone will be your digital concierge from, if you drive to work, being able to drop your car off and being able to have your car delivered to the front door, guidance into safest entrances, exits, elevators, floors, and amenities. You'll get communications during the day from building to building about what's being delivered where, enhanced amenities and bookings. So your phone will become much more your lifeblood as you're entering and exiting buildings and using buildings. Next slide. And you've heard so much over the last 15 months about air, fresh air. This is an example of a project where it's under construction right now with Hudson Pacific Properties. It's the old West Side Pavilion, not too far from UCLA, that's being adaptive reuse into a modern office building of the future. Google's taking the whole building, and what they're doing is they have many indoor and outdoor balconies. You see this in the rendering. You have stairs that connect the floors so you don't have to take the elevators. Food trucks that come up and pull up during the day to, access to amenities and F&B. Lots of indoor and outdoor spaces that are much different than, being in a hermetically sealed building. Really leveraging the exterior spaces in a real mixed use environment. Next slide. Another building that we finished during COVID, this is called Epic, and actually Netflix took a lot of this building. And what we did is we created interconnecting balconies that have outdoor spaces with stairs that connect them from floor to floor. This building's located in Hollywood. Next slide. From the big picture, and we've been hearing a lot about how people are going to work and where they're going to work. There's no doubt that the office still will be the hub for engagement, for collaboration, for learning, for socializing. Even in a hybrid environment, you still will potentially be working from home, but there's no doubt that the office will become the central hub for the collaboration and engagement. Next slide. But also, we're starting to see the idea that some of our clients are having a hub and spoke type of environment where they'll have the central office for the shared collaboration, but they will also have suburban locations where people can check in and touch down in a hybrid environment where you can work from home, but your office space isn't as far as it used to be. And so many of our clients are going to this shared office environment or hub and spoke type of concept with urban and suburban locations. Next slide. And a really key consideration, can't emphasize it enough, it came up in Leo and Jerry's presentation, that talent we're seeing right now, all our clients are focusing on talent, and there's a shortage of talent, severe shortage in the United States. You can see by 2030, there will be a global talent shortage, more than 85 million people around the globe. And so, the idea that the workplace becomes this magnet for people to come and collaborate and innovate becomes even more important. Next slide. So I conclude with all of you that the office matters more than ever. And as we now re-enter, and our clients are re-entering right now back into the workplace, some are in 3A or 3B, it's more relevant than ever. And you could see, that is the last slide, that the future still needs the workplace. The workplace is not dead, it's alive and well. Things will be different, we'll be in a hybrid mode, but it'll still be the glue that binds teams together, no matter where they're working. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Andy. And I think we have some time for questions. Allison and Cody, I understand that Slido has been lighting up with all kinds of questions for Andy.
Jerry, we're having some trouble opening up our video. I think the host had prevented us from being on video.
Oh, no. But are you able to ask questions?
Yeah, we can. Sorry.
Okay, great.
Oh, here we go. Oh, we're back. Okay. So I guess one of the things that we've learned about COVID is like a lot of the HVAC systems and the need for air purification. Is that something that Gensler is thinking about incorporating into office design? And can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And remember, there's all the existing building stock that we're dealing with, and then the future buildings we're designing. In the existing building stock, absolutely every developer and building owners looking at introducing more outside air changes, because you don't want stale air in the buildings and you want more air movement and more filters being put on their air systems. So it's a major consideration as we go back into the buildings, existing buildings. And the future buildings we're designing are absolutely incorporating the latest state of the art in mechanical and mechanical systems. So much so that what buildings we used to design with raised floor are now coming back in style, where the air is circulated below the floor and comes up into the space versus circulating from the ceiling. So you have much more direct contact with and more personalization of the air controls in building. But I can't emphasize enough how also, and this has to do with sustainability and dealing with climate change, is the ability for operable windows and sliding windows. And we're seeing this in every building. It's the demand of the tenants that there'll be big sliding doors. And I'm not just talking about LA, I'm talking in colder climates too. The ability to bring in more outside air, to have the ability to go outside and use outside balconies is so important moving forward on the buildings we design of the future. It's a great question. Thank you. Can't hear you right now.
Thank you, Andy.
Can't hear you.
Our next question is pertaining to gender preferences. So do you have a sense of work from home preferences between men and women? And do you think that perhaps we could see a widening gender pay gap if women work remotely more frequently than men?
Yeah, we didn't get into the gender. As you saw, our survey went across a potpourri of different roles and responsibilities. We didn't get into the gender differences. But clearly, what's really hurt women is the issue of schools and their kids being home from school, and it's impacted as people come back. How do you deal with working in a hybrid environment where you're still going to pick your kids up from school and dealing with working with the office? So I think it's a major issue. Gender diversity is so key, and having that flexibility, as I said before, designing flexibility in for people and especially for women, the ability, that flexibility of working at different hours based on their workload and based on their family's needs is going to be so pivotal moving forward, and wasn't being accommodated as much in the pre-pandemic world and will be accommodated in the post-pandemic world.
Great, and I guess this is going to go more back to the digital connectivity that you talked about and really bringing technology into the workspace. I guess we've seen a big divide of companies who are able to really adapt to that remote workforce pretty easily, and then the ones who maybe didn't have that technology up to date and ready to go. How will this really impact the office sector going forward, and companies that were more reluctant to adapt to more technology in the workplace? Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Definitely. You saw a big divide that happened of companies that weren't prepared for, this digital world that we live in, and I think it's so important. And I think that's really it's been transformational for companies as now most have adapted to this world. I think the key is going to be dealing with the office space as people go back and designing. As designers, we're designing spaces right now where the buildings are going to be much more user-friendly, much more digitally interconnected, as I mentioned before, from work and home, with the ability to plug in and plug out and have much more data, much more information of your workplace, and much more in control of your workplace that you're in. So I think that we're designing buildings right now that are on the boards. The next generation of buildings are going to be significant upgrade to what was in the pre-pandemic world, and technology is going to be a key consideration and an enabler to allow people to work in a hybrid environment, to be able to plug in and work anywhere, anytime in the office with that sense of choice, and the ability to work in third places like a Starbucks or satellite office or from home. And this has been a transformational time in digital technology. I can tell you the innovations that are occurring in technology are just amazing, that will be incorporated seamlessly into buildings moving forward.
I think we have time for one more question.
for our last question, let's see, somebody had asked, how do you keep open spaces clean? And I'll augment that a little bit and say, with a lot of these open spaces in COVID, employees are expecting probably a higher degree of cleanliness in the office. So do you have any insight as far as, the impact to operating expenses of these open areas?
Well, first, as I mentioned, the open plan is changing. And the idea that people are sitting right on top of one another and 60 square feet per person is changing. And what we're doing right now is we are, Gensler's designing spaces for our clients. Again, we're creating these work settings. You work in your home, you're working in your den, you're working at a table, you're working on the kitchen counter. So we're providing these different places where people have a sense of choice. There's no doubt that, cleanliness is going to be a key issue moving forward. We're designing materials right now that are more self-cleaning, that's been developed during COVID, so that they don't attract dirt, they don't attract germs. They're easy cleanable. There's no doubt about that, and that we're incorporating in the workplace. And absolutely, as we go back, you could see it already that a workplace is being cleaned many more times than it was in the past. The idea of dealing with germs and dealing with, the transmittability of germs is a key issue in the workplace design moving forward. And the materials are responding to that. It's a great question. Thank you.
So thank you to everyone for your questions. Just a couple of comments as we finish up here, Andy. One is the space that you and Gensler designed at Anderson. And it incorporates a lot of what you showed us.
Exactly.
And, when it initially went into place, many in my generation said, that doesn't look like people would occupy it, and it's fully occupied. And the other, you talked about socialization being an important part of the office, and kind of one subset of that, with the millennials and the Zs who are following that, is what Carboni and Cohn called the marriage market, right? That people those generations are going to want to be back in the office to socialize, not necessarily in the office, but after work in downtown LA or the West Side, because it's much easier to meet people and potentially a partner than if you're working from home in Acton or Barstow, right? So I think, you pointed out some really important things about what's going to happen. And we are really happy that you could join us. And thank you very much for coming and giving a very insightful keynote. Thank you.
It was an honor. Thank you very, very much. And I'm glad you're loving the building, because it was a great pleasure to design that for you. Thank you. Thank you to Tony.
I do. I just want my office to be moved over there. So if you could talk to Dean Bernardo about that.
I don't know how much influence I have on Tony, but I'll try. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So now we turn to our two panels, and the first panel will be a conversation between myself and John Tipton. John is a partner with the law firm of Allen Matkins, specializing in real estate law. He did his undergraduate work at Miami University. And as he reminds me, that's the one in Ohio, not in Florida. And law degree from Harvard. John and I have been collaborating on the Allen Matkins UCLA Anderson Forecast commercial real estate survey for California for 15 years now. It's been a great collaboration. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Jerry. It's great to be here. Allen Matkins has certainly enjoyed our collaboration with the UCLA Anderson Forecast these past 15 years. And I know I look forward every 6 months to seeing our survey results, to see some of the insights that our clients are thinking about in upcoming development, and the perspective it also provides to other participants in the real estate community. So thank you.
One of the interesting things in the current survey, so just to bring everyone up to date, we do the survey twice each year. It's a survey in 8 markets in California, over 4 spaces, the retail, multifamily, office, and industrial spaces. And we have just finished our latest survey, our summer 2021 survey. That's going to be published in maybe later this month or early in July. And so it'll be available to you all, but we have some first results. And one of the interesting results is in the office market. And I'm going to be kind of jumping back and forth, John, but I want to show some slides here.
Sure.
And so let me just share my screen. And so that's not the one I want. So this is, you know, what you all see here is, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. What you see here are the 6 markets that we were looking at for office space, and that 50 dashed line above 50 means optimism about what's going to happen in office space 3 years hence, and below 50 less optimistic. And that's for each of our panels in these 6 markets. And you see that it really dropped at the beginning of the pandemic. But what's interesting here is that you see in each market, more pronounced in the Bay Area than in Southern California, you see a move towards optimism. So let me just stop that for a moment. A move towards optimism. And one of the things that we found at our 10-year retrospective was it's not just the absolute value, but it's the direction of change. So as people are trickling back to the office, we're seeing exactly what Andy was talking about, that there's more optimism or maybe less pessimism on the part of developers and operators. I mean, there's still a lot of empty space, right? What are you seeing with your clients and hearing from your clients in this regard?
Sure. Well, and as I think as the charts show, you know, pre-pandemic, we had observed that office was somewhat at a cyclical peak, but was really holding its own, kind of hovering in the just optimistic level. The pandemic just froze everything in office. And there really has just been too much uncertainty for kind of the traditional office development momentum investments. And I would contrast that with maybe some of the hybrid specialty markets, such as life sciences, which remained very strong during the pandemic. To specifically answer your question, you know, there is traditionally, with the exception of some of my land use partners and some of their projects, there's a bit of a lag time between the idea germinating in the office developer's head and the phone ringing for your friendly real estate attorney. So I have not yet seen the level of demand for some of the traditional momentum plays yet. But what we are now seeing is a significant increase in the leasing activity. And ultimately, it's the leasing activity which fills the offices, which drives the demand and need for new office development. So I think it's coming, but it will take a bit more time as things sort out. You might also see a little positive trend in the retail sector, Jerry. And I don't know if we can put that slide up.
Sure. So let me go to that. So that's actually, I find that really quite interesting because, you know, we all think about retail as being a sector that's in the tank and been in the tank. I mean, this is a declining sector. Now we're talking about brick and mortar retail because retail sales are up, but they are up in online. But you see the same kind of thing happening here. And so this is the same chart, but it's with the same 6 of our 8 regions. The other 2 regions that we have that you don't see on there are the Inland Empire, and we've just started retail in the Inland Empire, and Sacramento area, including the Delta San Joaquin County. So you're starting to see a trend of less pessimism in retail. Part of that is because not a lot of retail space has been built. I think part is what Andy was talking about, right? That we have multi-use buildings and new concepts in office buildings. And so the developers are seeing retail perhaps getting better in that regard. But an interesting thing that you didn't see in the slide is that in Sacramento and San Joaquin County, really in inland California, developers are much more optimistic about retail. And I think that may have something to do with new home building and new home development, because if you put in a new development, you also need to develop the retail to support it, right?
Sure. And I think, as you said, if you look back at the chart, it's a little bit of relativity. I mean, retail is showing an increased strength, a decrease in pessimism, but still not up to the optimistic level.
Yeah, and we saw originally, let me put up the next one, which is multifamily.
Right.
Because I was just talking about the housing. Hopefully people aren't getting vertigo here. Maybe I should just leave the charts up.
That's fine.
And so this is multifamily housing, and optimism has returned to multifamily housing. So, we saw, for example, rents drop in San Francisco by more than 20%. San Francisco is all the way over on the left, and you see very optimistic developers and owners and managers of multifamily housing in San Francisco. The reading is above 60. You also see it in Silicon Valley and in the East Bay and all the way across, and of course in Sacramento. Sacramento is, I think, as many people know, the fastest growing large city in California. And so we are seeing developers optimistic. This fed into our forecast for increasing production of housing in California. And it does feed into retail as well.
Absolutely. Well, the slide, as you said, the chart shows begins in 2016, but really the same was true of multifamily even before that. I mean, it's been one of our two steady performers almost continuously, with, as you can see, the one survey that was taken back in June of 2020, kind of in the depths of the pandemic. I'm also interested to see how the demand for single family residences, which was so highlighted during the pandemic, and people wanting, more living space, really drove an increase in prices. Low interest rates fueled that as well. And I'm wondering to some degree how much, ironically, it's now driving a demand for more multifamily housing, simply because so many people are priced out of the single family market based on the rise in prices. But that will be an interesting thing to observe. We can sustain this kind of positivity in multifamily, certainly at these levels, which, although it was always a strong performer, right now it's showing gangbuster performance.
It is. And we had a conversation yesterday with someone help from CoreLogic, who said that, in the core cities now, there's been a rebasing of rents, and they're starting to see increased demand. As you say, people who are priced out of single family housing markets don't want to really rent in the suburbs, are coming back in the cities. But she said, also seeing new entrants to the labor market coming into the cities. They're now maybe not totally affordable, but they're more affordable than they were before. And I think that's some of what you're seeing in the Bay Area in this chart.
Right. Now, if you're looking for optimism in commercial real estate, which we always like optimism, then you don't really have to look any further than the fourth type of product that we survey, which is industrial.
Okay.
And like multifamily, other than the one survey we took during the depths of the depression, the pandemic, industrial has really been a rock star performer. One question I guess I have is, how much of this strength do you attribute to the ongoing structural change to more online consumer shopping? And how much do you believe the pandemic has kind of supercharged that going forward?
So, we expected this to be a good market simply because the trend in shopping from brick and mortar to online has been very strong, but the pandemic did supercharge it. And, some of the things that happened in the pandemic is many people who were not very involved with online shopping, they always went to the store, had their first experience with online shopping during the pandemic and discovered what it was. So I think this has really accelerated the move. Our panelists, looking forward over the next 3 years, have said kind of unequivocally that they expect demand for industrial space, and this part of industrial space would be warehouses, to be increasing faster than supply and at a faster rate than we've seen since we've been taking this survey, going all the way back 15 years. So
Wow.
this is a market that's been hot, it's now really red hot, and they expect it to continue. And there's simply not to be insufficient space going forward. So of course, what that means is rising rental rates and better rates of return in this market. And the other part of industrial that we're expecting to really grow is, maybe surprisingly, manufacturing. So as some manufacturing is reshored, particularly that part of manufacturing that's considered to be national security, manufacturing of national security products, like certain kinds of chips and circuit boards, that which needs a highly skilled technological workforce, but doesn't need tremendous amount of space, is going to be coming to California. And so we're expecting an increase in the demand for factories as well in California. It won't match the demand for manufacturing employees because of the automation, but in terms of the real estate, an increased demand for industrial space. And as I showed in my California presentation, we're still importing a lot. So industrial space is going to be red hot for a while. We have a lot of other questions in our survey, and we're going to be doing an analysis of those and publishing it before long. And so let's see. Looks like we've used up our time. So if you do have questions, feel free to email us. And if you're not on the list to receive the publication, please contact Alan Matkins or the Forecast, and we would be happy to put you on the list. John, it's been a great 15-year collaboration. Look forward to the survey going on for the indefinite future.
Thank you so much, Jerry. We certainly do enjoy it at Alan Matkins, and really are proud and cherish our partnership with UCLA Anderson Forecast. So thank you for having us, and love your performance, your presentations today.
Our pleasure. Now we turn to the second panel and take a deep dive into what's happening in commercial real estate in California and the nation. And this panel will be moderated by Professor Stuart Gabriel. Professor Gabriel is Distinguished Professor of Finance, and he is the Arden Chair in Real Estate and Faculty Director of the ZIMAN Institute for Real Estate Studies here at Anderson. So wears many hats and wears them very well. And Stuart, I'll turn it over to you to introduce your panel.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and good morning, everyone. And it's been a terrific program so far. Jerry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, just fine.
Perfect. Really, really interesting work by all of you at the UCLA Anderson Forecast, and extraordinarily interesting comments by all of your guests. We're in a very interesting point of inflection now, and we're seeing the inflection in real time as we emerge from this pandemic and as the cylinders are cranking, so to speak. And so we're appreciative of the bullishness of your forecast, Jerry, and the idea that we might be creating 1 million jobs a month for coming months, and that's absolutely extraordinary. We're hoping that we can maintain inflation, although we do anticipate this Fed tapering with respect to interest rates and all the rest. And as you know, I think Andy and John and you have just indicated, we're in a situation where certain commercial real estate markets have been depressed by the pandemic, but yet we see movement in the right direction together with some optimism. So let me introduce the panel that's going to join us now, as we're going to talk about new challenges in commercial real estate with some focus on office real estate, if you will. And with us today, in no particular order, are Malcolm Johnson, who is the founder and CEO of Langdon Park Capital. Malcolm, very nice to have you with us. James Malone, who's the Executive Vice President of Jones Lang LaSalle. James, thank you for joining us. Cherie Rady, a partner in Foley & Lardner. Cherie, thank you. And David Schulman, who is familiar to all of our viewers, distinguished former senior economist at UCLA Anderson Forecast and a most distinguished researcher and observer of real estate spaces, among other things, around the world. So wonderful to have you all with us. And I think perhaps the way we might be organized this morning is I'd like to turn first to David. And the reason to turn first to David is to, David, to ask you to interpret the macro forecast, firstly, that your colleagues have provided for the office sector in specific. All of these macro fundamentals, all of the macro outlook, mix it in a bowl, and what does it imply for the office sector going forward?
Well, the macro forecast is very good because there'll be an increase in employment, and that normally would drive increase in office demand. But I really think the real problem with office are micro factors rather than macro factors, and that's what Andy Cohn spoke about earlier. So I think that the issues are much more micro than macro. Normally, the macro environment would be terrific, but I think there's a series of micro headwinds that will be very meaningful.
Okay, let's drill into that a little bit further, David. So if you look at a release that comes from Green Street Partners most recently that pertains to the office sector, they speak about both private and public office REIT valuation down by about 8% currently. That's part of the COVID effect, of course. They do see some pickup in leasing that will, they believe, be evidenced later this year. They see supply that's well under control with increments to supply of no more than maybe 1% a year. They see 5-year same property NOI forecasts of roughly 1.5% to 2% going forward, a modest positive forecast. There was very adverse national net absorption in the top 50 markets of something like 63 million square feet in 2020. But yet they see debt markets as being highly accommodating. In other words, they're open for business, debt is well priced, and they see that as supportive of valuation in the office sector. So that's a bit of the translation of the broader macro into the specifics of the office sector. So now, David, with that, again, as a bit of introduction, take us away and tell us, in terms of specifics of the sector, what's concerning you.
Well, I think if you listen very carefully to what Andy Cohn said, is first of all, from the point of view of office owner of existing buildings, they will face huge capital expenditures to make their space very attractive for the returning workforce, and that will involve base building, especially around HVAC. It may involve all kinds of structural issues by opening up windows and creating outdoor space, and dealing with cleaning and safety issues. And will also mean for the new tenants coming in, a huge increase in tenant improvements. And if the market has high vacancies, it is the landlord will pay for the tenant improvements and not the tenant. So I think there's a huge CapEx burden coming, and there's a lot of obsolete office buildings around. The other issue is, which Green Street also talks about, by the way, is work from home, which Andy also spoke about. We're going to a hybrid model. And my sense is the work from home concept was proved during the pandemic. It works. We didn't know whether it would work prior to the pandemic, but the work from home concept has now been proven. And if you assume that people used to spend anywhere between 4.5 to 4 3/4 days a week in the office, and that now goes down to 3 to 3.5 days or 3 to 4 days in the offices, that requires less space. Part of that will be offset by a de-densification, which is what Andy also talked about. So he basically sort of stole my thunder, but to me his fundamental demand is probably going to be anywhere between 15 and 20% lower than what it would have been pre-pandemic for office space. And even though Green Street is talking about rising NOI and rising absorption, it's coming off very low base. So it isn't clear to me it's going to be back to where you were in 2018, 2019. So, that's my sense as to what I see is going on. And then the other issues is lease terms are going to get shorter, which will affect cap rates, because that was a trend going on before, because the tenant now wants, the occupier wants more flexibility. So we're going to see shorter lease terms going on as well. And then if you also listen to what Andy said, he talked about a hub and spoke concept, which means some of the office demand from traditional office centers are going to be shifted to be more suburban. And let me just make one comment on that is I did an interview with Glenn Rufrano for Baruch College a few weeks ago, and Glenn was the CEO of Beirut, and they're a net lease REIT that owns office space and restaurants and what have you. And he's been in conversation with a very major user in a very major city that's ready to offload 1 million to 2 million square feet of space to go suburban. And that conversation is taking place as we speak right now.
So David, thank you for that. Should we say dose of realism or dose of?
Well, I think this is for the tenant. No, listen, from the point of view of the tenant, if you want to say from the point of view of the tenant, the tenant will have a lot more to say about what's going on. So it's so from the point of view of the occupier, this is very good news. So forgetting about from the point of view of the owner, from the point of view of the occupier is going to have more choice. And from the point of view of the owner, the big issue is a lot of obsolete buildings out there, which is why we're going to see new construction, which showed up in the Matkins forecast, because you got to build modern space to take care of the 2025 environment.
Well, it's certainly a time with many looming question marks here. And David, you've translated a positive and a negative, the positive being the de-densification of office space, the negative being the work from home. And I'm speaking about positive and negative from the perspective of office demand, to a net of maybe minus 15 to 20% demand for office space, which is
compared to the trend.
Okay. Yeah, that's a big forecast. That's okay. So thank you very much. And David will come back. Let me just bring a few other of our guests into focus here. So Malcolm, you're in a unique place to observe office space demand, and I mean that in a bit of a literal sense in terms of geography. Tell us a little bit about your own story about demand for office space and what you're seeing in terms of the different geographies of office space that are blooming in the current situation. Maybe even comment a bit, if you will, about the standard centralization of office space as we've seen it over the course of the pre-pandemic period in the downtown areas and in the primary downtowns relative to what you might anticipate going forward.
Sure, happy to. And first of all, thank you to you, Stuart, and all the panelists and audience members. This is for all of us probably Zoom number 1,500,000 and some odd thousand over the last 18 months. So appreciate the attention and energy this morning. But although we had a pre-call for this panel a week ago, I didn't know that so much of what David just covered was going to be exactly what I've seen play out for our company. So first and foremost, we've all proven that work from home is effective. So I spent the better part of the first 12 months of the pandemic as an executive at JP Morgan Chase. So one of the largest financial institutions in the world. We've got a big footprint here in Southern California, and we immediately went to work from home in late March of 2020. And JP Morgan is actually still working from home for the majority of their office members across the country. And I was able to start a company from home. So I left JP Morgan in March of this year and launched Langdon Park Capital and was able to attract investors, build relationships with business partners, hire our first 3 team members, all virtually. And I think that speaks to the way we're going to use office in the coming years and decades. Office will be a place to meet and exchange ideas. It will not be a place where you have to show up every day in order to get things done. I think we've proven we can do that from our living room. So anecdotally, and I don't know if my experience is just my experience. So our company is focused on owning and operating properties that are not just in Black and Latino communities, but also create value for the residents of those communities and doing it in partnership with our investors, with our business partners. So that's our mission. That's the way we generate outsized returns for our investors. But because of that, we had a very specific focus on where we wanted to be in Los Angeles. And we focused first on the Crenshaw district, also in Inglewood. And we finally landed on West Adams, which is an historically Black community right in the heart of South LA. It's adjacent to the freeway. It's adjacent to public transportation. And for those last 2 reasons, it's also very attractive to major corporate tenants like Apple and Google and Herman Miller. And they have, in a lot of ways, kind of discovered one of the secrets of urban office. You provide a different type of amenity for your workers, but you also maintain the type of access and neighborhood retail feel that workers find attractive. It gives people a reason to be excited to show up. And for that reason, our landlord, as David just described, wanted to build a brand new building because much of the product in that submarket is older and for all intents and purposes functionally obsolete. So they built a brand new building. We're going to be the first tenant. We're taking a little over a third of the space in a 25,000 square foot building. But we are very unique because this is still, as David alluded to, a bit of a tenant's market. And I think the landlord anticipates that there will be continued strong demand in the long term. But because we're the first tenant, because there's still soft rents in places like Venice and Santa Monica and Century City, where I was at JP Morgan, we were able to get some concessions that I think 18 months on probably won't be available to tenants looking to be in this specific submarket. And the last thing I'll note, and again, this is why I say I don't know if this is just the case with us. So our next door neighbor in a building that's also owned by the exact same landlord is a company that I know really well. Their CEO is head of a production firm whose primary investor is actually Netflix. And rather than office in Hollywood, rather than office in Studio City, she was very focused. This is a Black woman who's written and told Black stories for decades. She was very focused on having her company, although it's a $100+ million enterprise. She too wanted to be in this particular submarket. And again, her space is brand new. It's been built out specifically for her, probably at a very high TI dollar cost for the landlord. But I think that's what you can anticipate in submarkets like the ones where we are. So I'm excited to be going in a new space, but I think what's even more interesting is that our team members are excited to be going in a new space when, as I pointed out and David said, we can all do this from home. So we have to have a reason to show up. Is it the cool restaurant that's down the street? Is it the floor to ceiling windows that actually open up? Is it the cafe on the first floor? that is run by a 20-something who actually speaks the language of the community. Like, those are things that excite people about coming to work, because otherwise we would all just as soon scrap the commute and do Zoom work like we've been able to do for the last 18 months. So that to me is the future from one tenant's point of view, but I think you'll find a number of users like Langdon Park Capital going forward.
Well, Malcolm, thank you very much. That's a very, very interesting story. And you're talking about an outcome which is extraordinarily positive in the sense that this diversification of office space is also has as an implication economic development of, historically African-American or other neighborhoods in a way that can be very, very positive for the community. Let me ask you just one other sort of follow-up to that. Would you generalize as well with respect to the diversification of places where people are going to want to work? Do you have a comment about the suburbs? There's just enormous debate right now about the suburbs as we see this rebalancing of sorts between central city and suburb. And so much of the migration data that we've seen coming out of the pandemic, there was a huge amount of controversy about whether the Californians were fleeing California in herds and going to Texas and everywhere else. And much of the net of that conversation is not so much California flight, but a lot of rebalancing between central city and suburb. And a lot of interest in suburb, a lot of interest in surrounding counties of Bay Area, of LA County, Sacramento, the Central Valley, et cetera. Do you see, and so David's told us one piece of the suburban office story. We've heard other pieces of that story. What would you say about that particular item?
So another really good question, and I'll be brief here, but I think, again, David was spot on. Suburban office is probably not going away, but the thing that has to be there is some differentiation. So commodity office space is probably going to be less valuable, even more so going forward than it ever was. Again, one quick story. I met last week with the principal at an architecture firm who we may be engaging to do some work at the properties we own. And this company's Southern California headquarters is actually in Irvine. So I would consider Irvine to be suburban residential community. And because they're an architecture firm, they went crazy on their space. So as kind of a marketing piece, they previewed for me some of what they did at their space in Irvine. And I could say that space is anything but commodity, is anything but standard. And that again, for them and their team members, that's what excites them about showing up at the office every day, because they could do CAD designs from their living room. So suburban office has a place, but I do think commodity office space will probably be far less valuable going forward than it has been in the past even.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's bring some of our other panelists into the conversation here. I'd like to turn to both James and Cherie. And well, maybe James, will start with you. I would suspect from where you sit at Jones Lang LaSalle, you are a very keen and acute observer of trends in office leasing. And I wonder if you could sort of factor into this conversation in that respect.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of good things in there. And, I think, David, while not being super rosy on the office sector moving forward, in Malcolm's case study, I think, there's a whole lot there, right? And I think, what you really have to do is just, you kind of got to break it down into its parts, right? I do think, how office space will be utilized is going to vary based on the size of your enterprise, right? So yes, occupiers do have options today, just based on what has happened. There's a lot more sublease space on the market, so that creates a lot more opportunity. But on the flip side, a lot of companies are just now coming back to the office. They're figuring out their plans of coming back. They don't know who's coming back. So, if you look at a small, enterprise that just started in March, like Malcolm's company, they could pick and choose in how they wanted to do it. But if you're a large, institution with, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 people, it's not a one size fits all, solution, right? So, And just, a few examples, right? Twitter and Facebook announced they were going full work from home. Nobody has to come in the office. Well, guess what? The other day, the head of real estate for Facebook said, offices are important for us. We, think it's great for people to be back, right? And they're not going to lose any office space, right? But there's other companies that are subleasing space. They're downsizing. They're taking the opportunity of, what I call, the last year, the great reset, to think about how they're going to, move their companies forward, right? So I think, the focus for a lot of companies as they start to plan now, and I think what you'll see in this, 6 to 12 months from now is that it's going to be a more employee-centric environment in terms of how spaces are built, how buildings are operated, how companies, look at their culture. Because, I think at the end of the day, there's going to be FOMO, right? So even though you're an employee who could work from home 5 days a week, every day, all day, every day, you're going to miss out on something that's going to say, oh no, I need to be in the office. So I think as we kind of shift into this hybrid work model where it's 2 or 3 days a week, it's going to morph into more of a hybrid work day. And people will, I think, generally come into the office every day. So that's not to say that, David's prediction about a 15 to 20%, decrease in demand is not going to turn out to be true, but I think it's going to depend on what sector you're in, how big your company is, and what you specifically as an employee do on a day-to-day basis. And that's going to translate into how, owners of real estate, become flexible with leases, become flexible with parking, what type of amenities they have in their buildings and how they operate their buildings. So it's, for us as a real estate service provider, those are all good things, right? Because people have problems they want to solve and they need help to do that. So there's going to be a lot of activity and, we'll see what shakes loose, but there are definitely some headwinds out there, right? So if you're a company that wants to go in and say, hey, look, we need to redo our whole space, for this new workplace. Well, guess what? Construction costs have gone through the roof. So if you still have 5 or 6 or, 7 years left on your lease, you got to pay for that money yourself. Construction costs are high, permitting times are delayed. So it's not going to just be an overnight thing, that happens. So it's, it'll be interesting to see how things, sort of materialize over the next 6 months.
Thank you, James. And James, let me, as you fully appreciate, many of the attendees in today's meeting are local to the LA metro area. And I'm not sure if you might be able to say a few words about some of our local industries, be they entertainment or some of the other predominant activities in the LA basin, and what sort of specific LA trends we might be looking at with respect to office.
Yeah. No, and look, LA is an interesting, market, right? It's very diverse, and we have multiple city centers, as it were. With downtown, Century City, Long Beach, the Valley, right? So there's 50 or 60 different sub markets in LA, right? Over 200, 300 million square feet, right? So any one particular sub market is going to have different dynamics, right? So we know that, in general in LA, content is king, and the content companies, they're going to keep growing and taking space. And I think we've seen that. And then the companies that provide content to them and that work with the other content creators, as Malcolm highlighted, they're going to be out looking for space in a particular type of space. So, I think that part of the market will continue to grow and continue to prosper. And there's, a lot of new buildings being built and, rehab, in markets to serve those tenants. So, I think you'll see a lot of activity as it relates to, that part of the market. The professional services, law firms, accounting, financial services, right? Those are, more, typical office users, right? But again, I think the fight for talent is going to cause those companies to look for, buildings and locations where they can recruit the best and where they have amenities where the employees, want to come to work every day. So, there's going to be a lot of opportunity seeking as we come out of this, because, again, there is a lot of sublease space on the west side and downtown, in other parts of LA County. So, people will be looking for opportunities. They'll find those, they'll go away. And then I think, as things kind of return to normal, there's a normal pace, and, hopefully, the time it takes to get space built, collapses, and and companies can make decisions, right, and do them in a timely manner, I think you'll start to see some movement with a lot of the professional services firms, right? But I do think, the days of the dense, bench seating and trying to get, 100 square foot per employee in a space are probably behind us, but not, we're not going to go back to the big, 20 by 20 private offices that we saw in the 80s. So I think that we'll be somewhere in between.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much for that. Let's welcome Cherie Radian to the conversation. And Cherie, you're in a very unique position in the work that you do, in that you have some observation that relates to commercial clients' tenancy and tenancy needs. And maybe you could drill this conversation down even further to, and we're sort of sliding here from the macro to the micro, and we've had kind of Malcolm and James in between, and David starting us off with very big picture, but take us all the way down to the micro here, Cherie, and tell us what you're seeing in terms of tenancy needs.
Well, thank you very much. I represent commercial and business clients, some business clients that were growing very rapidly prior to March 2020 and the pandemic. And all of a sudden, when the pandemic hit, they were looking, first of all, at no cash flow coming in. Many of their businesses, they weren't essentials, they were closed. And also, too much space. And so what we saw with many of these business clients was a reconsideration of their space needs, then a consolidation, moving, say, 2 locations into one, and then looking at subleasing the unused space, cash flow conservation with an interim 3 to 6 month rental deferment paid over the term of the lease during the 2020 year, and continuation of their leases. So basically, there were a lot of negotiations with landlords to stay in their locations, but also to have some cash flow relief, which landlords were amenable to. However, some of them found that they just had too much space, and so there was a subleasing of unused space, so that that could be better used by other businesses that had that need. So that's where we were. So where are we now? Well, now what we're seeing is just what Andy Cohen from Gensler a presentation was showing us, and also what James and Malcolm are saying. We're seeing a reconfiguration of space, glass offices, same size offices, smaller footprint, reassessing space needs due to offsite employees, but also, just as Andy Cohen said, all these modern amenities, all these interesting, bells and whistles, workrooms, small discussion rooms, communal kitchen / table areas. So just, enticements to have your employees come back and really enjoy the workplace. And so, some of these are in Class A buildings. So they're reconfiguring space that's already there, making it more, more enjoyable, so to speak. There's also what I think's been mentioned, COVID avoidance, contactless route and entrance procedures to enter, a path toward the exit. So there's one way in, one way out. There's temperature controls. There's all these things to make people feel more comfortable and contactlessness. We're also seeing in the larger buildings, COVID type deep cleaning every week. Just that they mentioned the HVAC, certain things have been put into to make the air more, clean, whatever. And now with the people that are vaccinated, we're seeing meetings being allowed together in indoor space without masks and this type of thing. So these are the I guess I took you from what I did see from March 2020 to now what we're seeing, more of a, and I do feel like some of the clients that offloaded the space are going to find they have a shortage, because once they open up, they're going to need space again. So I feel like trying to find that perfect amount of space, it's very difficult.
Yes, yes, indeed. And Sheree, are you, just for your response to a question that we've been considering throughout, which is the demand for space by location of space, and whether those who are part of your world are looking for space in the same places, or is there any diffusion in demand for space, or how would you describe that?
I think there is some diffusion, because I see, for example, maybe you would have been, say, in a downtown or, Century City, and now you might see someone opening up in Santa Monica or, other suburban locations that are really pleasant. So I am seeing diversification, and not just in the big city center.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to open this up to a broader discussion now amongst our panelists, and let any of our panelists who like to filter into the conversation to please do so. But I'm wondering again if the pandemic has taught us some lessons that relate to commutes, that relate to relative viability of different parts of a metro area. And there again, we're going to see some more permanent changes in the diffusion of economic activity relative to the extreme bias towards downtown San Francisco, downtown LA. Of course, LA is multinodal. I'm not saying that it isn't, but we have this organism that's called space, and it's constantly evolving in terms of preferences for space. And we've seen changes during the pandemic that would lead us to conclusions about sort of movement or shifts out of the San Franciscos and the New Yorks and the LAs, and to the Boulders and to the Austins and to the Portlands and all the rest. And maybe James or David or anyone else is this more of a permanent part of the landscape, or are we going to fully shift back?
Look, I think it's, again, it's not a one size fits all solution, right? And or problem. It affects everyone differently. And those with means, that can move to Boulder and still work, some people can do that. There's a lot of people that can't. And I think the cold reality that we face here in California is that we have a shortage of housing that people can afford, right? And so where you would want to work sometimes is determined on where you live and how long it's going to take you to get there. And so the flip side of that is the company is going to say, hey, although me as CEO would love to be in this neighborhood because I'm 5 minutes away, if I can't hire people to make my business successful, you can't office there. And so businesses, the bigger they get, the more central they're going to have to be to get the most amount of reach to employees, because people are going to be dispersed all over the county, and for that matter, all over the 5 counties: San Bernardino, Orange County, Riverside, Ventura, maybe even up in the Kern, where they can afford to live and send their kids to good school, but also be convenient to a job. So I don't think the pandemic has caused this big blow up and that cities are going to empty out and nobody's coming back. I think they will be back. I think you'll see, you'll find a story that'll fit a narrative you want to spin in any case. But I think as a whole, if we're sitting here, we're talking 3 years from now, I think we'll hopefully have seen, a big shift in a way that, people, look at cities, hopefully the cities function better, hopefully there's more affordable places to live, hopefully, well, traffic's going to be bad, right? So we all know that's going to be out there, but look, maybe people, the way they, look at commuting to work will change, right? And so if people have a flexible day, maybe traffic will just be not crappy for 2 hours. It'll be just kind of crappy the whole day, but you can still get somewhere versus like, I can't leave at 7 because it's going to take me 2 hours. But hey, if I leave at 9, it'll take me 45 minutes. That's not bad. So we'll see. But, I just think it's just going to be pretty interesting. And things will be different, this summer than they will be next spring. And then I think 2 years from now, that's kind of when things will settle, overall.
Very well. David, let me ask you to jump in. You've been a very good listener here, and there's been a lot of information.
Well, to me, is James just made the case for work from home, because what people hate most about their jobs, especially in LA, is the commute, and we all know that. And anything that's going to minimize commuting time, especially given the interaction with housing prices, is going to tend to favor people to work from home more if they can. And now, in attracting talent, that will be a terrific amenity to people, so you can live further away. And so you come into the office 3 days a week or something like that, or 3.5, depending, instead of coming in every day leaving the house at 6:30 in the morning to get in at 8:30 and leaving at 5 to get home at 7, so something like that. So I think that makes it easier for work from home. And I think and to attract talent is the talent may say, I'll be in the office 3 days, but I can't come in 5 days a week because I can't live that close to work, because the house costs $900,000 to $1.5 million or whatever, and they only could pay, say, $600,000 or whatever the number is. And so I think that's going to be ongoing, and I think that's going to be true in the Bay Area. It's going to be true in lots of major cities as well, and that also might lead to satellite offices, which is what Andy talked about, is having hub and spoke satellite offices depending on the company. So yeah, I think you made the case for me there, really.
Yeah. Well, but I think, David, what you're talking about is a hybrid model, right? So
yeah.
It's flexibility.
Absolutely, hybrid
it's
model.
not a full disgorgement of office space,
no,
right?
absolutely. I don't think you're going to have a full disgorgement. There are a few techies, there are a few people who could get away with, or a CEO could get away with 95% away from the office, but most people will be in some kind of hybrid model, and that'll range anywhere between 4 and 2 days a week in the office, depending on what their job is and what the social interactions are. And sometimes they'll be in the office 6 days a week because there's a crash project or what have you, but it's going to be all designed around flexible.
Very well. Here's another maybe broad question for our panelists. Now let's look across sectors of commercial real estate. And Andy brought up the very interesting example of the West Side Pavilion. And this idea that you took an antiquated retail center that was very large in its footprint, very well located and doing very poorly relative to the competition, in a world that was over-retailed, and converted that to a Google headquarters of the type of futuristic cutting edge design that he showed us in his slide deck. So now we have a world that is at least a New York City and a San Francisco and maybe an LA world that has excess retail, but it also has in some degree excess office. And but yet property values are so high that there could be some advantage to conversion and all the rest. So do we see more moves of the type that we've seen in the West Side Pavilion, or is that just sort of a one-off type situation that will not be replicated?
Yeah, well,
Go, Jim.
Sherry, if you want to opine, but I think we're going to see more of that. More adaptive reuse, if that's what you want to call it. Because look, that one West Side is great because it had all that parking and all that space, right? So it made sense, as the next logical play for that, right? But I do think that, rezoning is something that we have to do. Getting back to my point about creating more housing that people can afford. So hopefully that'll happen. With some of the product that is past its useful life and can work well for housing. But, from an adaptive reuse, point of view for office, we've already seen that a lot. As Malcolm highlighted on West Adams, Jefferson, that corridor, old warehouses being converted to office is great. There's, new multifamily housing going over there. So I think that's something, and especially in a county and an MSA as dense as we have here, it has to happen.
I would say that, definitely the West Side Pavilion and the Google is a big success. And so, more of that to come with, well-placed or positioned real estate makes a lot of sense. Mixed use has always been sort of the operative word, and that seems to be a good example. But I also agree with James that, there is a need for more housing and everything. So I think we'll sort of have to see, how is the city going to adapt on the zoning, what's the demand? I'm not exactly sure, but certainly that's, with a success like the Google West Side Pavilion, there should be more of that to come. I think it's kind of open, actually.
Very well, thank you, Cherie. David?
No, I think that's inevitable. Whether you get affordable housing out of that in those kinds of locations, I think is extraordinarily problematic. On that, I think it would just take huge amounts of subsidies, and the kinds of subsidy numbers I've been hearing for affordable housing, like delivering units at $700,000 a unit, the numbers just don't work. And so that to me is still going to be a problem.
Yeah. And I guess I'm making the distinction between affordable housing and housing that people can afford, right? So,
okay.
There's, market rate, we need more of both,
Right.
but yeah, I think it's yes and yes.
Right, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Very, very well. Well,
could I ask Sherry a question, which we talked about it in the pre-call, which I think is useful, is shorter lease terms, much more flexibility, not 300-page leases, but 12-page leases and stuff like that. Going forward, to give the occupier a lot more flexibility, because that's really a continuation of what WeWork sort of proved and Regis sort of proved, that there's a great need for flexibility among occupiers. And could you comment on that?
Well, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
To have a 12-page lease, that would be a wonderful thing. I think there are a few examples of leases that have, I guess, what you would call sort of moderate terms that are supposed to be neutral for landlord and tenant. I saw a couple of them used recently, and it was rather pleasant. I do think that I do think a shorter lease would be a lot better. I mean, 100-page lease is so long, and it's tedious. So I'm very hopeful that you're correct about that we will have shorter leases. And I agree with, there will be shorter terms. And I think that landlords will be very amenable to new tenants coming in and maybe helping them, or different space needs or reconfigurations, maybe paying for some of the tenant improvements. I think, that's a lot different than, say, a commercial lease tenant that's saying, I need to see if I can work something out right now. But that's really was all pandemic oriented into the, as we go into 2021, or as we start to, then I think it's going to be really good for tenants, but it's also going to be much better for landlords.
Well, that's a hopeful note. We're thank you, Cherie. Thank you very much for that. We're just about out of time, but I know that our real estate students are hoping to get in a word and hoping to get in a question. So if that's okay, James, I'm going to open it up to their questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Stuart. So one of the questions that had come up in a few different instances, just want to ask for the audience. There's a lot of interest in seeing if Mr. Cohen's deck is available for distribution after this presentation, or if it would be available online.
Yes, well, I'm going to defer to Jerry and the forecast on that.
Sure.
And
we-
we'll certainly do our best, Cody.
Of course.
Yeah, we are going to consult with Gensler and see what the possibility is. So stay tuned.
Perfect. Thank you. So one more question we have, with lease terms getting shorter and with these newer, sort of offices of the future, we're expecting the TIs will likely be more pricey. So how will owners and tenants amortize the cost of these TIs over a shorter term lease, and what impact will that have to the economics?
Good question. I'll take a stab. David, do you want to go?
No, you go ahead. You go ahead. You're doing it every day.
Yeah. So, yeah. So listen, I would say there's a couple things, right? So, and again, I think you got to kind of, break things down, right? So it's not, there's just, big tenants are going out getting 2-year leases. They're not doing that.
No.
Big tenants are still signing long leases. It's the amount of concessions in the deal that is changing right now, because it's very favorable in some cases, not all, for some of these tenants to negotiate, because there's space, so they have leverage, they have options, right? I would say though, for the smaller tenants, call them 2 to 10,000 square feet, particularly here in downtown, a number of landlords are pre-building the space. And in some cases, they're offering, shorter lease terms in addition to some free rent. They're offering sometimes to amortize furniture into the deal or do the cabling, make the space so it's move-in ready. And the reason that's happening is that, smaller tenants, they want to be in faster than bigger tenants do. They're less picky, so you can kind of, have a good sense of what the space needs would be. And, they can move in faster. And there's also a lot of sublease space out there. So it helps the landlords compete with all the sublease space that's already out there, because the landlords are ostensibly already getting the rent from those tenants that are trying to sublease. So, the lease flexibility piece, I don't think you're going to see short terms. I think you'll see landlords give tenants the option to terminate leases early. We saw that trend coming out of the Great Recession. I think that'll continue. But I think, when you look at, some of the bigger deals that have happened recently, they've been, long-term, 10, 12, 15-year deals.
I would say that for the smaller tenants, there are a lot of options out there. And I think we've mentioned some of them, but, shorter term leases, there's options. You're probably not going to get as many, tenant improvements paid for on a shorter term lease, but but maybe those are already built into the location you're going to go to, because they're made for, they're more updated and they're made for the, the smaller tenants. So I think, economically it has to work for the landlord.
Right. But guess what? We're kind of talking around it. Landlords are now doing it, and it's already been a thing. It's called co-working, and that's your short-term option. So landlords are going to have that option available. We've already seen, with different companies buying some of these co-working operators, or investing, or actually running in on their own. They're going to have, hey, Mr. Tenant, you don't know what you need. You think you're going to grow? Well, here, you can take this. It's month to month. You're going to pay a fee. The good news for the landlord is that's usually at a higher rate than doing a regular lease. They can mark it up, but they provide services and whatnot. So I think it kind of speaks to, the importance of landlords, having, good environments, some flexibility, not only with space and what they're offering, but, just being able to work with tenants and to accommodate their needs if they're, need to be in quick, if they need space to grow and whatnot. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for providing that context. We just want to thank you as well, Jerry, for allowing us to partner with you all. So thank you to the panelists.
And I do have, 2 announcements. One is an answer to the question about the slides. And we have permission from Gensler to distribute the slides. They will come out to you in the highlights email. So the slides, those slides will be distributed. And this brings our program to a close. This has been a great panel. Thank all of you and each of you for joining us on this panel with your insights. And before you all leave for the day, it's important that I once again thank our sponsors. We couldn't put the program on, or our series of programs. We couldn't do our research without your support. So our principal sponsor today is RSM. Many thanks to RSM. Our platinum sponsor, the law firm of Allen Matkins, Cathay Bank, Clark Construction, Leap Development, University Credit Union. At the gold level, Bank of California, California Bank and Trust, California Steel Industries, Robert Half, Wells Fargo, the private bank. At the silver level, Pacific Western Bank, Union Bank, the private bank. At the bronze level, Colliers, Hanmi Bank, HDR, Marsh & McLellan Insurance Agency, MBK Real Estate Companies, and PCL Construction. At the Bruin level, First Choice Bank, Gerber Kawasaki Wealth and Investment Management, Illy Commercial Real Estate, Marcus and Millichamp, Parkview Financial, our media sponsor, the Los Angeles Business Journal, and UCLA Extension, our academic sponsor. Many thanks to all of them. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and many, many thanks to our panelists and speakers today. This concludes our June UCLA Anderson Forecast Economic Outlook and Real Estate Outlook, joint with the ZIMAN Center for Real Estate at UCLA Anderson. Our next conference will be at the end of September, where we'll be focusing on inequality. And our keynote speaker is Mary Daly, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. We have a great program lined up. Look forward to seeing you all then. Take care, and look forward to seeing you all in person one day in the not too distant future.